What if the beginning of human history is only the part that survived? It is a quiet question, but it lingers in places where ancient clay still carries the pressure of a human hand from 5,000 years ago. In museum drawers, in excavation catalogues, in the low-lit storage rooms behind famous galleries, there are tablets from southern Iraq whose edges are chipped away like eroded riverbanks. Their lines break off in mid-thought, their names dissolve into cracks. Their stories remain, but only in fragments, copied and recopied by scribes who lived centuries after the first telling. Historians study them carefully, archaeologists brush dust from them one grain at a time. Assyriologists compare signs, gaps, and variants in the hope that something once spoken beside a temple wall may come back into view. And yet the deeper they look, the stranger the old beginning sometimes feels. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from, and what your local time is right now, as this story drifts out across different nights, different cities, and different quiet rooms. You begin in your mind, where many such stories begin, on the flat alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates, where the land is wide, low, and patient. The air is warm even after sunset. Reeds lean in black silhouettes along the canal edges. Mud brick walls hold the day's heat, somewhere nearby. Bitumen clings to timber and basket boats. The smell is part wet earth, part smoke, part river salt, part something ancient and mineral that seems to rise from the ground itself. The stars appear not above mountains, but above horizon lines so open that the sky feels almost architectural, like a ceiling laid over the first experiments in human settlement. This is Mesopotamia, though not yet in the tidy way schoolbooks often present it. Not a neat map with arrows and dates, but a living floodplain of shifting channels, temple compounds, storehouses, work gangs, songs, taxes, prayers, and memory. Long before stone monuments dominated the imagination of later empires, this land learned to build with mud, reed, labour, and repetition. Here, people shaped clay into bricks, bowls, tablets, and seals. They irrigated barley fields through carefully maintained canals. They raised temple terraces above the flood zone. They counted grain, sheep, and jars of oil. They named months, offerings, and officials. In the city of Uruk, one of the earliest great urban centres, the evidence suggests dense settlement and organised administration by the late 4th millennium BCE, and from such places the first known writing slowly emerged, not as literature at first, but as accounting, record, and control. That grounded fact by itself is already astonishing. Writing did not appear in a thunderclap of philosophy. It seems to have grown from practical need, from stored goods and measured obligations. The first signs were tied to counting, distribution, and management. Human civilization, at least in one major cradle of urban life, may have written its first marks not to ask who it was, but to keep track of what it owed. And yet, once writing existed, the old question slipped in. When later scribes pressed wedge-shaped signs into clay, they did not only record rations and land transfers, they also preserved hymns, laments, king lists, myths, debates, and stories of creation. The records are fragmentary. Many come from old Babylonian copies of older Sumerian traditions. Some survive in broken school tablets. Others come from libraries assembled long after the earliest cities rose. But within them, in scattered lines and damaged columns, there appears an unsettling possibility. Humanity, according to some of these traditions, may not have been imagined as the crown of creation in the flattering way later cultures sometimes preferred. Instead, people were shaped within a cosmic economy of labour, obligation, and divine tension. You feel the atmosphere change as you enter that idea. Imagine sitting inside a scribal room. The lamp flame bends slightly in the night air. Fresh clay rests under damp cloth. A teacher dictates old lines to students. each one repeating what has already been repeated for generations. The story is older than the tablet in front of him, older than the room, older, perhaps, than the city itself in its present form. But the words are not being spoken as fantasy in the modern sense. They are part memory, part ritual inheritance, part explanation of why the world is arranged as it is. And somewhere inside that inheritance is a difficult thought, that human beings entered the world because the gods themselves had a problem. This is one of the peculiar features of Mesopotamian myth. The divine world is not always serene. The gods argue, they divide roles, they grow weary, they build, decree, regret, and intervene. In one strand of tradition, lesser divine beings labour under the weight of maintaining the ordered world. Canals must be dug, earth must be worked, structures must be raised. The burden becomes intolerable, a complaint rises upward, a decision follows, another being is needed, something between clay and divinity, something capable of labour, obedience, ritual service, and survival in the dusty middle ground between temple and field. That is not the only reading, and scholars remain cautious. The surviving tablets differ. Some lines are damaged beyond recovery. Mythic texts often existed in multiple versions, shaped by place and period. What one city emphasized, another may have softened or rearranged. Even the sequence of divine actions can be difficult to reconstruct with confidence. But enough remains to suggest that early Mesopotamian creation was not always imagined as a simple blessing. It may also have been understood as an assignment. There is a fringe curiosity too, one that has drawn readers for generations, especially those inclined to look for hidden layers beneath official history. Some have wondered whether these myths preserve a distorted memory of a forgotten elite, an earlier ruling order, or a cultural shock so ancient that it survived only in symbolic form. Mainstream scholarship does not treat such ideas as established fact, and rightly so. The texts are literary, ritual, and theological documents, not transparent eyewitness reports. Still, the persistence of certain images, beings descending, order imposed, clay infused with a higher element, labour assigned from above, gives the imagination something to linger over in the dark. And the dark, here, matters. Because the Sumerian world did not begin with abstract philosophy. It began with exposure, heat on the plain, water arriving and failing, crops depending on collective maintenance, cities surviving by systems fragile enough to collapse if neglected. In such a world, the boundary between cosmic order and social order would not have felt symbolic. It would have felt immediate. If canals silted up, fields died, if offerings ceased, blessing might seem to withdraw. If kingship failed, walls weakened, myth and administration, temple and granary, heaven and labour, all touched each other more closely than modern people often expect. So as you move deeper into this ancient landscape, the question stays with you. Not whether the myths are literally reporting an event in a modern sense, but whether they are preserving, through image and ritual language, an older anxiety about what human beings are for. Were people imagined as kin to the gods, as servants of the gods, as experiments of the gods, or as a little of all three at once? The record does not answer cleanly. It gives you pieces, a line about clay, a line about blood, a complaint among divine workers, a birth goddess at her task, a city copying these things centuries after the first telling, perhaps not fully understanding them either. You stand there, in thought, on the threshold of that uncertainty. Behind you lies the familiar version of ancient history, with its dates, dynasties, and excavated walls. Ahead lies something older in mood, though not always older in proof. A remembered world before explanation became stable. A story whose edges are worn away. A beginning that may already have been ancient when the first scribes pressed it into clay. And in the slow night air of Mesopotamia, under stars reflected in black canal water, it becomes possible to feel that humanity's first origin story was never meant to make you comfortable. It was meant to place you inside an order already in motion, already burdened, already mysterious, and only partly willing to explain why you were here. The morning arrives first as temperature. Before the sun is fully visible, you can already feel the heat gathering inside the mud brick walls, stored from the previous day, waiting to return. The air holds the scent of damp reeds and trampled earth near the canal bank, but farther from the water it turns dusty and mineral, touched by ash from cooking fires and the faint, oily tang of bitumen used to seal boats, baskets, and foundations. You walk slowly through a landscape that does not rise dramatically, but spreads outward in the layers of labour. Flat roofs, courtyards, storage jars, low walls patched with fresh clay, narrow paths hardened by feet, carts, and animals, palm trunks lashed into beams, a dog asleep in the strip of shade beside a doorway. Somewhere close, grain is being ground on stone, its dry rhythm mixing with bird calls and the distant slosh of water lifted from a channel. In this world, the river is not just scenery, it is a system of survival. Southern Mesopotamia had little stone and relatively little timber, but it had silt, reeds, clay, and moving water. Those things shaped nearly everything. Temples and houses rose from mud brick because mud brick was abundant. Boats slid through marsh and canal because water linked field, city, and shrine. Fields of barley depended on irrigation so carefully managed that work itself became a kind of seasonal devotion. Archaeologists studying early Mesopotamian settlements have long noted how deeply urban life was tied to water control, and how irrigation agriculture helped support the dense populations and institutional structures that allowed cities like Uruk, Ur, and later Lagash to flourish. Civilization here was not simply invented, it was maintained, day after day, by repair. The land teaches you that quickly. You kneel beside a canal embankment in your imagination and touch the packed mud. It is cool beneath the surface. Small reed fragments cling to your fingertips. The bank has been cut, reinforced, walked on, repaired, and cut again. This is not wild ground, it is managed earth, disciplined into usefulness by hands that almost never enter the written record as individuals. The great inscriptions remember rulers, temple dedications, victories, offerings, and construction projects. But the irrigation ditch remembers everyone else. It remembers anonymous workers, bent backs, woven baskets of silt, sore hands, shouted instructions, and the quiet exhaustion of people whose effort kept whole cities alive. That detail matters because the old myths emerged from this texture of life. They were not composed in an abstract emptiness. They rose in places where labour was visible everywhere. You see a team dragging clay in baskets. Another group presses bricks into moulds. Women carry jars. A scribe sits beneath shade, noting distributions. Priests prepare offerings in a precinct where smoke curls upward in thin blue lines. Oxen shift under harness. A child watches adults measure grain. Even the wind seems to move through systems of obligation. And in such a landscape, it becomes easier to understand why a creation story might imagine humanity in practical terms, as beings shaped for work, maintenance, service, and continuity. Still, the setting is not only harsh, it has a strange softness at its edges. At dawn, reed beds shine silver. Water catches pale light before the rest of the plain wakes. White birds step delicately through the shallows. Date palms cast long bars of shadow. Fresh clay on a wall can appear almost rose-coloured for a few brief minutes. The silence before the day's noise has its own presence, especially near temple courtyards, where incense and morning air briefly mingle. Ancient Mesopotamian religion was embedded in ordinary environments so completely that even routine acts, baking bread, pouring beer, sweeping a threshold, shaping bricks, could exist within a sacred frame. The gods were not imagined as distant abstractions alone. Their presence was attached to city cults, divine households, local shrines, celestial signs, and agricultural fortune. You move toward one of the temples in your mind and begin to see how that sacred geography worked. The building rises higher than nearby houses, its platform lifting it above flood level and public gaze. The walls are thick. The doorway is narrow enough to control entry and dramatic enough to matter. Within, coolness gathers where sunlight cannot fully reach. There may be woven mats, offering tables, storage rooms, jars of oil, baskets of grain, and the cultivated stillness of a place where ritual order is preserved more carefully than ordinary time. In later Mesopotamian tradition, temples were often understood as houses of the gods, maintained through offerings, music, washing, clothing, and food presentation. Divine images were not merely decorative. They were treated with a seriousness that blurred the line between symbol and inhabited presence. And here, again, a curious possibility emerges. Some fringe-minded readers have suggested that the temple complexes of early Mesopotamia preserve echoes of a deeper memory. That priesthood, labour systems, and stories of divine rulership may conceal traces of an older order in which humans were organised under powers not fully remembered. The cautious historian steps back from such claims, and with good reason. Temple economies can be explained through known religious, political, and administrative development. No hidden civilization is required to account for them. Yet the myths themselves often speak in ways that keep the imagination half awake. They describe gods who dwell, eat, decree, and assign. They imagine the world as administered from above. They blur divine household and political household until both seem to mirror each other. What remains uncertain is how early listeners understood that mirror. Did they hear these stories as literal sacred history, as ritual theology, as poetic explanation, or as all of these at once? Scholars debate such questions because evidence of reception is thin. The texts survive, but the full emotional life surrounding them does not. A line recited in a temple festival may not have meant exactly the same thing when copied in a scribal school centuries later. A city under stress might hear cosmic hierarchy differently from a prosperous one. The record lets you see the words, but not always the silence around them. As the day grows hotter, the city sharpens. You hear flies gathering where refuse lies in the sun. You smell fish drying. Clay cracks on a wall whose surface had seemed smooth at dawn. Sand grits under your sandals. Beyond the canal, fields stretch in regulated strips, green where water has reached, pale where it has not. The achievement is real and deeply human. This is not some ghost civilization appearing out of nowhere. It is the cumulative work of settled communities across millennia, from the Ubaid period villages to the great urban expansions that transformed southern Mesopotamia. Pottery styles changed, administrative habits developed, monumental construction grew more ambitious, social hierarchies deepened. By the time myths were inscribed in recognizable literary form, countless generations had already lived, worked, adapted, and forgotten. And perhaps forgetting is part of the setting too. Not dramatic forgetting, not an instant loss, something slower. Oral memory narrowing, ritual language preserving names while their original meanings dim. A city copying old lines because they are old, not because anyone still fully knows why they began. You can almost feel that process in the air, as real as the dust. A world shaped by repetition learns to preserve what it cannot entirely explain, so the landscape itself becomes a participant in the mystery. The reeds whisper but reveal nothing. Clay records, but only partially. Water nourishes and erases. Heat preserves mud brick until rain, and neglect reduce it again to earth. Human beings build, count, and pray here with remarkable skill. Yet they do so within a setting that constantly reminds them how fragile continuity is. A canal can fail, a dynasty can fall, a tablet can break. A god's name can survive while the oldest meaning behind it drifts out of reach. By late morning the sun is high enough to flatten the colours of the plain. The silver has gone from the water. The softness has burned away. What remains is glare, labour, and the visible machinery of an ancient world that made stories not in isolation, but in the hard company of land, water, and need. When the Sumerians and their successors imagined the beginning of humanity, they did so here, where survival depended on order, and order always seemed to come from somewhere beyond any single human life. By midday, the clay has changed character. What felt cool and pliant at dawn now dries almost as soon as it is exposed. A fresh tablet, still soft under the stylus, must be handled with care. Too much pressure and the edge buckles. Too little, and the sign will fade when the surface tightens. You sit for a moment in the shade of a workroom and imagine the scribe's wrist moving with practiced restraint, pressing wedge after wedge into damp earth. The sound is so small that in a noisy room it might be lost completely, a faint sequence of taps, pauses and turns. But inside those marks a civilization stores its memory. Not all of it, of course, only what someone thought worth preserving, assigning, teaching, reciting, or copying. Even then, much of what was written disappeared. Clay survives by accident as often as by intention. Fire hardens a tablet, a collapsed wall seals it, a ruined archive becomes a time capsule without meaning to. This is one of the quiet ironies of ancient Mesopotamia. The very material that seems humble, mud from a river plain, became one of the most durable carriers of human thought. Papyrus rots, leather perishes, cloth vanishes, but a fired or sun-baked clay tablet, once buried in dry soil, can outlast empires. That is why so much of what we know about Sumerian and Akkadian literature comes to us not as polished books, but as fragments from ruins, school exercises from Nippur, lexical lists from scribal houses, damaged myths from temple archives, omen collections, hymns, lamentations, royal inscriptions, and copies of compositions already old when they were copied. The survival is astonishing but never complete. A corner missing can remove a god's name. A crack through the middle can erase an entire motive. You begin to understand that ancient records rarely speak in one voice. A single myth may survive in several copies from different periods, none fully identical. A hymn can reflect local theology. A king list can mix memory with ideology. A literary composition might preserve older oral material while also reshaping it for a newer audience. Sumerian myths known today often come through later manuscripts, especially from old Babylonian scribal contexts, which means the story you encounter is already layered with time. The word's ancient, but the tablet may be younger than the tradition it contains by many centuries. This is one reason scholars move carefully. When a text seems to describe primeval events, it may also be telling you something about the city and school that preserved it. Inside the scribal room, that complexity is alive. You picture apprentice students sitting on reed mats with tablets on their laps, copying sign lists again and again until their fingers ache and their posture slackens. Their education is demanding. Writing cuneiform is not a casual skill. It requires memory, discipline, and access to a scholarly tradition controlled by institutions. A student begins with simple signs and model phrases, then moves into lists of professions, animals, woods, stones, cities, and divine names. Eventually he copies proverbs, hymns, myths, and formal literary works. In such a world, stories are not merely entertainment. They are part of elite training, cultural continuity, and the shaping of an educated mind. That makes the myths feel less distant and more intentional. When a creation story is copied in a school or preserved in a temple archive, it is being treated as something useful. Useful not necessarily in the modern factual sense, but useful in transmitting order. A myth explains relationships, gods to gods, cities to gods, kings to temples, humans to labour, birth to death, flood to renewal. The old narratives may not give you chronology the way a modern historian would wish, but they do give structure. They place human life inside a sacred arrangement, one in which your duties, vulnerabilities, and hopes are not random. And yet the arrangement is unstable enough to invite questions. Take the king lists, for example, on the surface as they appear administrative and historical, a succession of rulers, cities, and reign lengths. But the farther back they go, the stranger they become. Some early kings are said to have ruled for impossibly long spans, tens of thousands of years in certain traditions, especially in the antediluvian section before the flood. Mainstream scholarship usually reads these numbers symbolically, ideologically, or as part of a literary way of marking deep antiquity rather than literal chronology. That is sensible. Still, the effect is haunting. The lists seem to say that remembered history was only the shallow end of time, and that before the world of ordinary kings there stretched another age, barely imaginable, where rule itself had a different scale. The fringe imagination has always been drawn to that kind of detail. Some readers have proposed hidden chronologies, vanished epochs, or forgotten classes of beings behind the enormous reigns and mythic dynasties. These claims go far beyond what the evidence can bear, and the tablets do not require such readings. Yet the curiosity remains because the records themselves invite it. They preserve an official memory that already feels like a ruin. Even when the scribes are careful, the world they describe contains gaps, exaggerations, and symbols whose original context may have been old beyond recovery. You lean closer to the tablet in your mind and notice something else. Ancient records often preserve uncertainty without announcing it. A line may break, a sign may be ambiguous, a god's epithet may shift depending on the copy. A term translated one way by an early scholar may later be re-examined and understood differently. Assyriology, for all its impressive rigour, is a field built on revision as much as recovery. New joins are made. Old readings are questioned. Lexical parallels illuminate one passage while complicating another. What seems clear in one decade may become less certain in the next. That does not weaken the field. It makes it honest. And honesty, here, has a particular mood. It is not certainty, but nearness. You're near the past, yet never entirely inside it. A broken tablet can feel almost intimate because it preserves the touch of the person who made it. Finger impressions remain in the margins. Stylus pressure reveals hesitation. Sometimes tablets were recopied from older exemplars now lost. So what you are holding is a memory pressed into clay by someone who may not have fully understood the origin of what he copied. The story arrives through hands, institutions, accidents, and centuries of silent burial. It is no wonder that the beginning of humanity appears in such records not as one clean statement, but as a cluster of preserved echoes. The room darkens slightly as a woven shade is lowered across the doorway. Outside, the heat has become difficult. Inside, clay waits under cloth, damp enough for more work. A teacher recites a line about divine decree, another about the shaping of a life. A student falters and starts again. Somewhere in the city, a temple singer rehearses a hymn whose language is already archaic. Somewhere else, a storehouse clerk tallies barley and beer. Both acts belong to the same civilization. Both depend on writing. Both are forms of memory. So when you ask what ancient records can tell you about the origin of humanity, the answer is both generous and elusive. They can tell you that the question mattered. They can tell you that Mesopotamian tradition preserved more than one beginning, more than one divine motive, more than one image of what humans were made from and meant to do. They can tell you that scribes kept these traditions alive across changing kingdoms and languages. But they cannot give you a final, unified version untouched by time. What they offer instead is more atmospheric and, in its own way, more powerful. They offer fragments carrying the weight of continuity. They offer myths copied with care by people who believed that old words still mattered. They offer a beginning that survives not as a polished monument, but as a damaged record whose missing pieces may be part of the message itself. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs to old time. Not ordinary silence, not the simple pause between voices, but the larger silence left when names outlast their meanings, and ruins outlast the people who built them. You feel it while standing in imagination on a mound of broken mud brick, one of the many tales scattered across Mesopotamia, where centuries of settlement have risen and collapsed in layers. Potsherds lie underfoot. Burnt brick fragments emerge from dust. A wall line appears for a moment in low light. then vanishes again into the colour of the earth. Archaeology can date levels, compare ceramics, trace architectural changes, and recover astonishing amounts of information from such places. Yet even the most careful excavation only reaches what was left behind. Whole stretches of human experience remain absent, especially in the deeper periods before writing became common enough to speak clearly. This is where the hidden timeline begins to gather its quiet force. The standard historical outline is familiar enough. Long before cities, people lived in villages. Agriculture developed gradually in different regions. In southern Mesopotamia, settled communities expanded over many centuries, with the Ubaid period laying important foundations before the Uruk period saw dramatic urban growth. Administrative innovation, monumental architecture, and the increasing use of proto-writing. That broad sequence rests on real evidence: ceramics, settlement patterns, burials, tools, botanical remains, seals, and buildings. It is not guesswork, but evidence of development is not the same as complete understanding. Early urban life did not emerge from a blank space. It rose from older social worlds, many of which remain only partially visible. You walk, in thought, across ground that seems empty until it is explained. What looks like a natural rise is actually accumulated habitation. What seems like loose dirt is compressed history, the remains of floors, hearths, courtyards, collapses, rebuildings, and abandonment. A city is not one thing here, it is a stack of attempts. Beneath a later wall may lie an earlier wall built on an older surface that itself covered refuse, ash, and flood silts. Time in Mesopotamia is not laid out like a straight road. It is buried vertically, then disturbed, then reburied. To excavate it is to move downward through forgotten arrangements of life, and the myths in their own way seem to know that, again and again. Sumerian and later Mesopotamian traditions gesture toward ages beyond ordinary recall. They speak of times when kingship descended from heaven, when divine order had not yet settled into familiar form, when gods walked more visibly among the structures of the world, when floods reset history, and when names now dimly understood belong to beings or places that may have seemed ancient even to the scribes who wrote them. The language is not modern chronology. It does not separate legend or ritual memory and sacred history in the neat categories scholars prefer. Instead, it gives you atmosphere and sequence in a looser, older way. There was a time before, then another before that, then a break, then cities, temples, kings, and human obligations. One mainstream historical detail deepens the feeling. Some of the earliest monumental precincts at Uruk, particularly in the Iana district and the Anu precinct, show long development across phases rather than a single moment of foundation. Architecture changed. Platforms grew. Public ritual space expanded. Administrative tools multiplied. This tells you that what later looked like a sacred centre had been accumulating significance over time. A holy place was not born complete. It became old by surviving its own revisions. That is true of myth as well. Sacred memory builds in layers, but there is also a more unusual tidbit that slips through the edges of discussion. Certain readers have long been fascinated by the possibility that myth preserves a dim remembrance of cultures or authorities so early that later Mesopotamians could only describe them in divine terms. This is not accepted scholarship, and there is no firm evidence for a lost super-civilization ruling the floodplain before known history. Still, the urge to ask such questions comes from something real in the texts. Their primeval scenes often do not feel like simple folk tales. They feel administrative, hierarchical, and already organized. Even the gods seem to inhabit systems older than the human world. You pause beside that thought because it may reveal more about human memory than about vanished empires. When a civilization looks backward, it rarely imagines true emptiness. It imagines prior order. If the present world has kings, laws, fields, households, workshops, and sacred offices, then the first world will often be imagined as possessing earlier versions of those things in grander and more mysterious form. Primeval time becomes not chaos, but prototype. In Mesopotamian myth, this can make the past feel strangely bureaucratic. There are decrees, assignments, craft roles, places designated for divine powers. The world begins not with innocence, but with structure. Still, scholars remain divided on how much of this reflects genuine cultural memory and how much reflects the logic of later temple and palace societies projected backward onto the beginning of time. That uncertainty matters. It is possible that creation myths tell you less about prehistoric events than about the societies that preserved them. A scribble culture built on order may naturally imagine the cosmos as ordered from the start. A temple city may tell origin stories in the language of duty because duty shapes daily life. And yet it is also possible that some motifs, especially those repeated across long periods and different traditions, carry deeper inheritances whose first settings are no longer recoverable. In the afternoon heat, this question becomes almost physical. The plane shimmers. Distance dissolves into glare. A ruin on the horizon appears close, then recedes. You realize how easily a landscape can erase its own timeline. Floodwater leaves silt. Wind moves dust. Mud brick melts back into earth when neglected. Organic materials vanish almost completely. What survives to archaeology is impressive, but selective. Whole structures of belief, speech, and social life must be inferred from traces. If writing came late to this deep past, then much of what shaped the earliest remembered stories entered the record only after being filtered through generations of retelling. That helps explain the haunted feeling of ancient origins in Mesopotamia. The first cities we can name are not presented as beginnings in the absolute sense. They already inherit something. Even when a text names the founding of order, it often hints that order had a heavenly or primeval existence beforehand. Before the first city wall stands the idea of sacred kingship. Before the first temple stands the pattern of divine dwelling. Before the first human task stands the decree assigning it. The world arrives with precedent. You stand there in that layered time, listening to wind move through dry grass growing from an abandoned mound, and it becomes easier to imagine how a culture might preserve a hidden timeline without ever writing it plainly. Not because it wished to conceal a secret in the modern conspiratorial sense, but because the oldest parts of its memory were never fully historical to begin with. They were sacred, inherited, ritually repeated, and already half symbolic by the time they were written down. A forgotten age does not have to be factual in every detail to shape everything that comes after it. By late afternoon, shadows begin to return to the edges of walls and pits. The harshness softens. The mound becomes legible again as architecture rather than dust. You can almost believe that if you kept digging carefully enough. The first answer would eventually appear. But Mesopotamia does not yield its beginnings that way. It yields foundations, fragments, phases, and suggestions. It yields enough to know that history has depth, and enough to suspect that memory has even more. As evening approaches, the world becomes easier to read. The glare drains out of the sky. Edges return. The tops of walls catch the last gold light while courtyards settle into shadow. Workers carry tools home along paths that looked empty in the heat of day. A priest closes a gate. A donkey shakes dust from its coat. Farther off, somewhere near a canal landing, voices rise and fall in a language of bargaining and routine. In this softer light, systems emerge, not just buildings and roads, but arrangements. Storage beside temple, workshop beside yard, shrine beside administrative room, field beyond embankment, water beyond field, labour behind all of it. It is the kind of landscape that teaches you to see patterns because survival depends on them, and that is exactly how the ancient myths begin to feel when you spend enough time with them. Not like one smooth story, but like the remains of a machine scattered across centuries. A line here about divine assemblies, another there about sacred powers called me, the decreed functions or attributes that shape civilization and cosmic order. Somewhere else, a list of gods with specialized roles, a story of creation that emphasizes labor, another that emphasizes wisdom, birth, craft, or decree. None of these pieces alone gives a full design, but slowly, with patience, you begin to see how the world was imagined as layered, organized, and assigned from above. One of the most intriguing mainstream features of Sumerian religion is precisely this strong sense of distributed cosmic function. Different gods governed different domains, and those domains were not abstract in the modern sense. They were bound to real things: fresh water, storm, love, kingship, grain, writing, war, fertility, city identity, craftsmanship, Enki, associated with the subterranean fresh waters of the Abzu, wisdom, craft, and cunning intelligence, occupies one kind of space, Enlil, tied to authority, wind, command, and the ordering of destinies, occupies another. Inanna moves through desire, power, and political complexity with a force all her own. Ninhursag, under different names and aspects, can appear in connections to birth, shaping, and maternal potency. This is not random polytheism. It is a system of differentiated power. You begin to sense how ancient listeners may have understood reality through such divisions. The world was not made once and left alone. It was allocated, assigned, maintained, ritual reinforced it, kingship reflected it, labour participated in it. To live in society was not merely to survive nature, it was to occupy a place within a sacred arrangement whose pieces had names and expectations. Even the city itself mirrored this pattern. A major Mesopotamian city often possessed its patron deity, temple household, priests, economic institutions, dependent workers, agricultural resources, and administrative records, as though the divine and social orders were meant to echo each other. That brings you to the curious terme, one of those difficult Sumerian concepts that scholars translate only cautiously. The Mi are often described as divine ordinances, powers, principles, or cultural institutions, things like kingship, truth, weaving, music, lamentation, wisdom, and office. In some literary texts, they are treated almost like transferable components of civilization, held by gods and associated with the functioning of the world. It is a remarkable idea. Rather than imagining culture as something humans invent alone, the tradition sometimes imagines it as descending in packets of sacred legitimacy. Music has its force, kingship has its force, priesthood has its force, sexuality, craftsmanship, mourning, law, speech, and rule all belong to a larger inventory of ordered existence. A fringe-minded reader cannot help noticing how unusual this feels. Some have wondered whether the Mi reflect a memory of an older framework, a catalogue of sacred technologies or civilizational templates preserved in mythic language. That interpretation goes much further than the evidence allows, and serious scholarship usually treats the Mi in literary and religious terms rather than as coded records of lost science. Still, the fascination lingers because the concept itself is so elegant and strange. Civilization appears not as improvisation, but as installation. The uncertainty lies in how literally or symbolically ancient audiences understood such ideas. Were the mythological abstractions for temple-trained elites, or did ordinary people absorb some version of them through ritual and civic life? Did myths about divine allocation reflect metaphysical belief, political ideology, or poetic dramatization? Scholars debate these questions because evidence of popular reception is sparse. Most surviving texts come from literate and institutional settings. The shepherd, brewer, canal worker, or potter rarely explains in his own words how he understood the cosmic system. You know the structure from the top more than from the ground. Even so, the ground is where the structure becomes visible. You move through the city in twilight, and everything seems to carry assigned purpose. The kiln, the seal, the granary, the gate, the shrine lamp, the tablet room, the brewery jars lined in rows, the woven reed doors, the brick mould stacked by a wall, the ox team moving in slow circles. Nothing in this world is without relation. It belongs somewhere, answers to someone, serves something. The Sumerian imagination seems to have extended that same principle outward into the cosmos. The divine world also had roles, ranks, jurisdictions, and duties. The universe was less like a wilderness than an estate. And then comes the unsettling thought. If the world was structured this way from the beginning, where exactly do humans fit? Not at the centre, perhaps. Not as owners. More as participants, dependents, maintainers, and ritual servants within a vast established order. That idea feels closer to Mesopotamian myth than later modern ideals of individual self-definition. Humanity in these traditions often appears as part of a managed system, needed for its labour and offerings, but never entirely sovereign. In the fading light, temple windows glow faintly from within. Somewhere a musician plucks a stringed instrument. Somewhere else a reciter speaks a line learned long ago. You can imagine how stories of divine order would sound at this hour. Not like entertainment, but like explanation dressed in poetry. Why is there kingship? Because it was decreed. Why are there rituals? Because sacred powers were distributed. Why do cities have destinies? Because divine authority assigned them. Why do humans work, serve, build, and maintain? Because the world itself was built as a system of roles. One mainstream detail strengthens the realism of that vision. Temple institutions in Mesopotamia were not merely symbolic religious centres. They often operated as major economic entities, controlling land, labour, storage, and distribution. Administrative tablets from various periods record rations, offerings, herds, textiles, and personnel with immense seriousness. The sacred and practical were deeply entangled. So when myths describe a divinely ordered world, they are speaking from within cultures where order was already material, measurable, and institutional, and still, it may be that something older glimmers beneath even that. Perhaps not a hidden empire or literal lost technology, but a deeper human intuition that civilization does not feel invented from scratch. It feels inherited, as though the rules, once established, arrive with such force that later generations can only say they must have come from gods. Some have wondered whether myths like these preserve the emotional memory of first complexity itself, the shock of entering a world where roles, labour, law, and hierarchy had become too large for any one person to explain. Night gathers more fully now. The system remains, but it softens into shadow. The city is still organised, still functioning, yet no longer fully visible. And that may be the best way to understand the Sumerian reconstruction of the world. You do not see the whole machine. You see lamps burning in different rooms. You hear parts moving. You glimpse the pattern in fragments. But even those fragments are enough to suggest that the forbidden origin of humanity was never imagined as accidental. It belonged to a design, distributed across powers, duties, and sacred assignments, whose full blueprint is still mostly hidden in the dark. Night settles gently over the plain, and with it comes the question that the old stories never quite let go. Why were human beings made at all? The city sounds different now. Daytime noise has thinned into isolated traces. A gate shuts with a wooden thud. Water laps softly against a moored boat. Somewhere in a courtyard, a low conversation drifts upward and disappears. The smell of warmer mud brick lingers after sunset, mixed now with lamp oil, cooked grain, and the faint sweetness of date syrup. Above everything hangs the open Mesopotamian sky, immense and dry, with stars appearing in patient numbers. In such an hour, the ancient creation stories lose whatever sharpness they had in daylight and begin to feel more personal, more inward. You're no longer just examining a myth. You're being asked to stand inside its logic. And in that logic, humanity does not simply arrive. Humanity is assigned. One of the most discussed Mesopotamian creation traditions appears in the Akkadian Atrahasis, where the lesser gods labour and eventually revolt against their burdens. In that account, humanity is created so that the gods may be relieved of toil. The details vary across traditions, and the surviving record is not perfectly unified. but the central idea is difficult to ignore. Human beings enter the world in response to divine need. They are not the leisurely final flourish of a completed cosmos. They are a solution. That is a startling thought, especially when placed against the physical reality of Mesopotamian life. Human survival in the river plain required constant work, digging, lifting, repairing, planting, hauling, baking, counting, shaping, cleaning, building. It would have made immediate sense to imagine labour not as a temporary inconvenience, but as part of the structure of existence itself. The myths do not flatter human ease. They explain human burden. If the world feels like a place where maintenance never ends, perhaps that is because maintenance was written into the beginning. But even that is not the whole story, because Mesopotamian myth rarely treats humanity as merely animal. Humans may be made for service, but they are also made with something unusual. In some traditions, clay is mixed with divine substance, often interpreted as the flesh or blood of a slain god in later versions or related traditions. The symbolism matters. Clay alone would suggest earthliness, fragility, and local belonging. Divine addition suggests animation, mind, destiny, or sacred entanglement. The result is a being caught between worlds, made of dust yet bearing some trace of higher origin. Scholars remain careful with exact interpretation because different texts handle the motif differently, and some readings depend on damaged lines or later parallels. Still, the pattern is strong enough to matter. Humanity is lowly material shaped by something not entirely lowly. You can feel the tension in that. To be made from clay is to belong to the river plain, to the same ground used for bricks, walls, ovens, ceilings, and tablets. Clay cracks, dissolves, and returns to mud. It can be shaped beautifully, but it remains vulnerable. To be mixed with divine essence, however one defines it, is to carry something that exceeds utility. It implies that human beings were not only tools, they were also containers, of awareness, perhaps, of obligation, of resemblance, of dangerous nearness to the powers that shaped them. This is where a more unusual fringe reading often enters. Some have speculated that the myths preserve a memory of alteration rather than simple creation, that human beings were modified, refined, or intentionally adjusted from an earlier state. Mainstream scholarship does not treat the texts as evidence of biological engineering or literal intervention by hidden advanced beings. Such claims stretch myth beyond what the sources can responsibly support. Yet the language of shaping, mixing, and assigning does create a suggestive atmosphere. The old stories sometimes sound less like spontaneous creation and more like careful preparation. And preparation for what? The standard answer is labour and ritual service. Humans work fields, build structures, maintain cults, and provide offerings. Temples in Mesopotamia functioned as places where divine care was materially enacted through food, clothing, washing, incense, music, and recitation. In that sense, humanity's purpose was not merely economic, it was relational. Humans sustained the divine order through visible acts of maintenance. The gods, in return, sustained the conditions of life, fertility, stability, victory, rainfall in some regions, and above all the continuity of cosmic arrangement. Still, our scholars debate how literally such service should be understood. Were the myths expressing a theological truth that ancient listeners accepted straightforwardly? Or were they dramatizing the social reality of temple-centered life in sacred terms? Perhaps both. It may be that creation stories gave divine depth to already existing institutions. It is also possible that they preserved older religious intuitions that later institutions merely inherited. The record cannot fully separate these layers. What survives is a fusion of myth, ideology, ritual language, and remembered cosmology. As you move through the night city in imagination, humanity's role becomes visible in small things. A woman grinding grain by lamplight, a man patching a basket rim for the next day's work, a boy carrying water jars, a temple attendant checking a storeroom seal, someone singing softly while kneading dough. These are ordinary scenes, But the Mesopotamian world did not sharply divide ordinary from sacred. Food, washing, offerings, and work all touched the divine order. The maintenance of life itself could be understood as participation in a larger structure first established by the gods. There is something both humbling and unsettling about that view. Humbling because it places human beings inside a cosmos larger than themselves. Unsettling because it suggests that human purpose may not have begun in freedom. The myths do not always ask what humans desire. They ask why humans were needed. Yet even within that need, there are hints of tenderness. Some creation traditions involve goddesses of birth or shaping, figures associated with womb, craft, and formation. This softens the picture. Humanity may have been made for work, but not carelessly. There is handling in these myths, moulding, gestation, deliberation. The act of making life retains something intimate even when the reason behind it feels severe. A grounded historical detail deepens the mood here. Mesopotamian birth practices and understandings of the body were embedded in both practical knowledge and divine association. Goddesses connected with birth and creation were not abstract ornaments in myth. They belonged to a world where fertility, lineage, and survival were urgent concerns. So when a text imagines a divine birth maker fashioning humans, it draws on deeply familiar realities of fragility, dependence, and risk. The debate remains unresolved because the texts themselves are unresolved. Was humanity created as servant, image, intermediary, replacement labour, ritual caretaker, or something stranger that later tradition only partially remembered? Different compositions lean in different directions. Some emphasize burden, some emphasize wisdom and design. Some preserve motifs whose earliest meanings are difficult to recover. A broken line can hold an entire lost possibility. The stars grow brighter overhead. The river smell cools. Lamps flicker lower inside the houses, and you are left with a portrait of humanity that is more ambiguous than many later origin stories would allow. Not simply fallen, not simply exalted, not simply accidental. Formed from the earth, touched by the divine, placed into a functioning world, and given tasks whose meaning may once have been obvious to those who first told the tale. Perhaps that is what makes these myths feel quietly forbidden even now. They do not promise that humans were made to rule. They suggest something more complicated, and perhaps more ancient, that you are made to belong to an order already underway, and that the deepest question is not what you can become, but what those first makers intended when they pressed life into clay. The deepest ideas often become quietest at midnight. By now the city has mostly surrendered to darkness. Courtyards are still, roofs lie silver under moonlight. The canal, so busy in daylight, has turned into a long black ribbon carrying stars on its surface. Smoke from banked cooking fires hangs low and thin, barely visible unless it passes in front of a lamp. Somewhere a dog barks once and then gives up the effort. Most of what remains is stillness, and stillness has a way of changing how stories behave. In daylight, an origin myth can seem like a puzzle to be solved. At night, it becomes something softer, more elusive, more like a room you enter slowly and do not wish to disturb. Perhaps that is the right way to approach the question now. Perhaps the Sumerian and Mesopotamian traditions were never trying to provide a single clean answer to where humanity came from. It may be that they were circling a more difficult truth, one too large to name directly. Human beings seem to the ancient world both ordinary and strange. Ordinary because they were made of the same materials as everything else that suffered and decayed. Mud, water, breath, heat, hunger, blood. Strange because they could speak, remember, calculate, worship, build, lament, and preserve names longer than stone sometimes could. A being capable of hauling reeds by day and asking cosmic questions by night would have seemed difficult to explain by simple means. So the myths answered in layers. It is possible that one layer was social. People worked because life required work, and the stories reflected that. Another layer may have been sacred. People served the gods because the world felt inhabited by powers greater than themselves. Another layer may have been psychological. The burden of life needed a reason, and divine purpose gave burden shape. But perhaps there was still another layer, less visible, almost hidden inside the others. Some have wondered whether the myths preserve the feeling that humans were altered in some way at the beginning. Not merely made, but made with intention so specific that later generations could only preserve it through symbol. That suggestion cannot be proved, and the sources do not speak with enough directness to settle it. Scholars continue to debate the meanings of crucial passages, especially where texts are broken or filtered through later copies. Yet the atmosphere remains. Mesopotamian creation is often narrated less as a celebration than as an arrangement. Something is planned, something is assigned, something is prepared. You feel design in it, but not the warm, reassuring design of a bedtime prayer. More the sober design of a world already in motion before human beings took their place inside it. You walk, in thought, through an empty temple courtyard under moonlight. The paving is cooler now. The walls release the last of the day's heat. A carved threshold feels rough under your palm. Inside, behind doors and curtains, sacred images rest in darkness, attended no longer by the full movement of ritual, but still present in the mind of the city. It may be that ancient people felt themselves continually observed by the divine, but it is also possible that they felt something else just as strongly, that the divine order had already set the terms of human existence long before any one person was born. To live was to enter an agreement already signed. One grounded historical detail helps anchor this feeling. Mesopotamian legal and administrative culture placed high value on established order, recorded obligation, inherited office, and continuity of function. Contracts, rations, land boundaries, and institutional roles all depended on recognition that place and duty mattered. When such a civilization imagined the cosmos, it naturally imagined decrees, destinies, and assigned roles at the level of heaven as well. Myth did not float above life. It mirrored its structures in magnified form, and yet the unusual detail remains difficult to dismiss. Across different ancient traditions, not only in Mesopotamia but in neighbouring cultures as well, stories recur in which human beings are shaped from low material and animated by some higher essence. Earth and breath, clay and blood, dust and spirit. It may be coincidence. It may be the universal logic of agricultural societies close to the soil, or it may suggest that certain early human intuitions about origin were widely shared long before the surviving texts took final form. Some have wondered whether such repeated imagery points to a very old inherited symbolic pattern, perhaps older than the cities that wrote it down. It is also possible that the forbidden quality of these myths comes not from secrecy, but from discomfort. They do not flatter human autonomy. They hint that consciousness itself may have been given with conditions attached, to know, but also to serve, to build, but also to depend, to remember, but never enough to see the whole design. That is not a popular modern message. It does not tell you that humanity is self-made. It suggests that humanity may have been positioned. Midnight invites gentler language, so the thoughts arrive more carefully now. Perhaps the gods in these stories are not literal beings in the modern material sense, but ancient ways of speaking about powers too large for simple categories. Perhaps divine labour stands for the burden built into the universe. Perhaps the shaping of humanity from clay means that self-awareness emerged from the same fragile matter as the rest of life. Yet with some additional spark, ancient people could feel but not define. Perhaps the stories encode political hierarchies. Perhaps they preserve ritual truths. Perhaps they carry echoes of memories so old that they had already become sacred metaphor by the time the first scribe copied them. Scholars remain divided because the evidence permits several readings at once. Literary structure, ritual use, social ideology, comparative mythology, and deep symbolic continuity all offer plausible lenses. None explains everything. That may be why the old records feel alive. A solved text can become a museum label. An unresolved one continues to breathe. You sit for a while on the low parapet of a roof and look across the sleeping city. Here and there, small lamps still burn. A watchman moves along a wall, Somewhere a baby cries briefly and is soothed. These are human sounds, ordinary sounds, yet within the Mesopotamian imagination they unfold inside a cosmos thick with decree and memory. No one in this city is simply alone. Every action belongs to a pattern of household, temple, field, and sky. Even sleep feels assigned its place, and so the origin of humanity drifts away from the demand for a single answer. It becomes more reflective, more like the contemplation of a vessel whose shape can be felt even when the maker's hand is no longer visible. It may be that the first storytellers understood something modern people often resist, that being human is not just a biological fact but a burdened role, one filled with tasks, limitations, and strange capacities that feel given rather than chosen. The moon passes over the canal, reeds murmur at the edge of the water. The city remains in its long, breathing silence, and inside that silence, the oldest Sumerian question no longer sounds like a historical problem to be solved by force. It sounds like a patient uncertainty. What are you, really, if clay was not enough, and the divine touch, whatever it meant, was never fully explained? Below the sleeping city, the old stories place water, not the open water of the canal, not the river current carrying reeds and silt through moonlight, but a deeper water, hidden and foundational. The sweet underground reservoir known in Mesopotamian thought as the Abzu. It is one of the most beautiful and mysterious features of their imagination. Beneath the dust, beneath the baked brick, beneath the labour of human hands, there lies a concealed source, fresh, dark, and generative. In some temple architecture, this idea took physical form. At Eridu, the ancient city closely associated with Enki, archaeologists found a long sequence of temple layers showing that sacred space there was rebuilt again and again over centuries, as though devotion itself had roots in the ground. Eridu was remembered in later tradition as one of the earliest cities, and its god was no ordinary ruler of sky or storm. He belonged to hidden water, wisdom, craft, and subtle design. If there is a divine intelligence in Mesopotamian myth that feels especially difficult to pin down, it is Enki. You can imagine his presence best at night, not dramatic, not thunderous, but patient and quiet, like the sound of water moving where you cannot see it. He is often the one who knows how things work. He understands boundaries, but also how to bend them. He advises, engineers, arranges, rescues, and sometimes deceives. In later Akkadian tradition, he is known as Ea, and his personality remains strikingly consistent, wise, fertile in strategy, associated with craft, language, incantation, and the hidden powers beneath the visible world. If Enlil represents command and decree, Enki often feels like the mind that moves underneath decree, testing its edges and discovering what can still be done. That makes him deeply relevant to the question of human origin in some Mesopotamian creation traditions, especially those involving the shaping of humanity from clay and divine substance. A figure like Enki stands near the act of design, not always as the sole creator, but as the intelligence guiding process. The exact details vary by composition, and scholars are careful not to flatten separate myths into one master narrative. Yet the pattern is suggestive. Humanity is not only born through force or command. Humanity is thought through, planned, assembled through craft. This is not the language of explosion. It is the language of workshop, mould, and measured intention. You move in imagination toward the sanctuary of Eridu at the quietest hour of night. The walls are dark. The air is cooler near the marsh edge. Frogs sound from the reeds, and insects hum in the dampness hidden beyond the torchlit ground. Eridu itself was located near zones where water and land met in complicated ways, and that ecology matters. A god of fresh subterranean water emerging in such a place is not arbitrary. He belongs to the lived environment, the abundance beneath scarcity, the concealed source beneath the dry crust of the world. In agricultural terms, fresh water means survival. In mythic terms, concealed fresh water means secret origin. One mainstream historical detail strengthens the mood. Eridu is among the earliest known temple sites in southern Mesopotamia, with a long developmental sequence beginning in the Ubaid period. That does not prove every later legend about its antiquity, but it does mean that Mesopotamians were attaching sacred memory to a place genuinely old by the standards of their world. A city remembered as ancient was often ancient. The mythic aura gathered around real age, real rebuilding, real continuity, but the unusual fringe tidbit surrounding Enki is harder to ignore once you notice it. Some modern readers, especially those drawn to hidden history speculation, see in Enki the image of a prohibited benefactor, a being who gave too much to humanity, or who participated in shaping humans in ways later divine authority found troubling. This goes well beyond what the sources explicitly say, and there is no scholarly consensus for such a dramatic reading. Yet something in Enki's character encourages it. He's often associated with saving, advising, or preserving life through cunning rather than force. He knows what others do not. He works through channels, plans, and subtle reversals. If any god in Mesopotamian literature feels like the keeper of a dangerous kindness, it may be him. That idea becomes especially powerful when placed beside the human condition itself. What are human beings in these myths? Labourers, yes. Ritual servants, yes. But also creatures with intelligence, language, technical ability, and memory. Those are not trivial gifts. Writing, irrigation, architecture, metallurgy, weaving, music, and ritual all belong to a world in which humans do far more than merely carry burdens. They participate in order by understanding it. The Mesopotamian city depends not only on effort but on knowledge. When to plant, how to shape a canal, how to count goods, how to read omens, how to prepare offerings, how to speak names correctly, how to build walls that endure another season. Humanity is not simply muscle. Humanity is instructed clay. Scholars remain uncertain how to read the relationship between divine wisdom and human skill in these traditions. Did the myths imagine knowledge as graciously bestowed, ritually guarded, or always partially restricted? The texts suggest all three at different times. Cultural institutions are often traced to divine origin. Techniques and offices can carry sacred legitimacy, yet wisdom is not distributed evenly. Priests, scribes, diviners, craftsmen, and rulers stand closer to certain forms of sanctioned knowledge than ordinary labourers do. It is possible that myth was helping explain social hierarchy through sacred categories. It is also possible that the sacred categories emerged because knowledge itself felt uncanny. You feel that uncanniness in the smallest things. A stylus making language visible, a seal impression proving identity, a kiln hardening clay into permanence, a chant shaping fear into order. These acts are ordinary in one sense and nearly magical in another. To ancient people, the line between craft and sacred power was not as sharp as it often appears to modern minds. The skilled person could seem almost to borrow from divine patterns, bringing hidden possibilities out of raw material. Enki, as lord of craft and concealed intelligence, belongs exactly to that world. The night deepens, the thought becomes softer. Perhaps Enki is not a rebel in any crude sense, but a symbol of the truth that creation was never merely mechanical. It may be that the human being, as imagined in Mesopotamian myth, was shaped with enough intelligence to carry out labour, but also enough inwardness to question labour, enough memory to preserve ritual, but also enough imagination to wonder about its purpose, enough skill to maintain the system, but also enough awareness to feel the system's weight. If so, then the hidden design of humanity was always double. Service on the outside, mystery within, and maybe that is why the origin feels forbidden. Not because the facts were hidden in secret vaults, but because the old myths imply that to understand humanity fully, you would have to understand not only what humans were made to do, but what capacity was placed inside them by the powers that shape them. The texts do not resolve that point. They give you a god of hidden water, an ancient city of temple rebuilding, and a pattern of wisdom too close to survival to be ornamental. Above the city, the stars hold steady. Below it, in myth, if not in visible earth, the Abzu remains dark and full, and somewhere between the two, humanity lives on the surface, made from clay, dependent on labour, yet carrying within itself a trace of design subtle enough that even now it can only be approached through symbol, water, and night. Toward the darkest part of the night, the world seems less built and more born. The city is still there, of course. Its walls have not vanished. Its storehouses, courtyards, ovens, altars, and sleeping households remain exactly where they were. Yet under starlight the harder outlines soften, and what begins to stand out is not the geometry of construction, but the sense of enclosure, of holding, of waiting. A courtyard becomes a bowl of shadow. A kiln resembles a hollowed womb in the earth. A storage jar buried to its shoulder in packed floor looks almost organic, as if the city itself has been shaped rather than assembled. It is in this mood that the feminine side of Mesopotamian creation begins to make itself felt, quieter than kingship, less visible than labour, but just as old. For all the emphasis on decree, assignment, and divine planning, ancient Mesopotamian tradition also knew that life had to pass through the logic of birth. This is where figures such as Ninhursag and related maternal or birth-associated goddesses under various names and local traditions enter the story with unusual force. The exact relationships among these divine figures can be difficult to simplify. Mesopotamian religion developed over long periods, and gods absorbed functions, titles, and local identities in ways that do not always fit a single clear chart. Still, scholars broadly recognize the importance of female divine powers associated with birth, mountains, fertility, shaping, and maternal authority. In myths touching on creation, these figures often embody the capacity to form life, carry it, bring it forth, or give structure to what divine intention alone cannot yet make living. That matters because clay by itself is not enough. Clay can be shaped into bricks and tablets, into bowls and figurines, into weights and seals, but in the human imagination, clay made alive requires a transition from object to body. It needs moisture, touch, internal warmth, and the mystery of animation. The Mesopotamian story world often places that threshold in feminine divine hands, not always alone, and not always in one consistent way, but often enough that a pattern emerges. The world may be ordered through decree, but the human being enters it through formation, through kneading, moulding, gestation, birth. You imagine a workspace at the edge of a temple quarter where women are preparing dough before dawn. Hands press, fold, turn, and smooth. The movement is skillful, repetitive, intimate. Nearby, another woman cradles a child not yet asleep. The gestures belong to ordinary life, yet they illuminate something deep in the myths. Creation is not only command, it is handling, it is bodily knowledge. It is the transformation of pliant matter into something that carries breath. Hunger and future, a civilization that lived so close to clay, grain, blood, and birth would hardly imagine the making of humanity as an abstract moment detached from the textures of touch. One grounded historical detail helps anchor this. Mesopotamian societies cared intensely about fertility, kinship, inheritance, and childbirth, and they left behind legal, medical, and ritual texts that show how central birth and family continuity were to everyday life. Women's bodies, family lines, and reproductive success were deeply bound to household and social survival. In such a setting, it is natural that myths of creation would borrow the language and imagery of birth work. The divine womb was not a poetic luxury. It was a sacred counterpart to one of the most real and risky human experiences. And yet there is a strange edge to these maternal myths too. In some texts, the creation of humans or living beings involves not gentle ease, but strain, intervention, and specialized knowledge. Birth does not happen automatically. It requires incantation, timing, proper material, and sometimes sacrifice. This has led some fringe interpreters to wonder whether the old stories preserve a memory of difficult manufacture rather than simple generation, as though humanity emerged from an act more technical than natural. Mainstream scholarship remains far more cautious, and wisely so. Mythic creation language often merges craft and birth in symbolic ways without implying hidden technology. Still, the combination itself is revealing. Humans are not simply born like animals in the field, they are prepared through a ritualized process of shaping. That ritual quality gives the myths their peculiar solemnity. It is possible that Mesopotamian listeners sensed that human life was both ordinary and ceremonial. Every birth in a house or courtyard repeated, in reduced form, the original problem of bringing shaped matter into living order. Every newborn entered a fragile body already exposed to disease, hunger, and mortality. Every child also entered a world of language, gods, obligations, and inherited names. The distance between a human infant and a freshly formed clay figure may have felt smaller to ancient imagination than it does to modern minds. Both begin soft. Both depend on careful handling. Both must survive drying, pressure, and time. Scholars remain uncertain how much of the maternal creation imagery in these myths reflect broad social religion and how much belongs to temple-centered literary tradition. The evidence, as so often, comes mostly from texts preserved in elite or institutional contexts. We can reconstruct names, motifs, and ritual echoes, but not always the emotional texture of how non-literate people heard such stories. Did ordinary mothers in Mesopotamia see their own labour reflected in divine creation narratives? It seems plausible, but the record cannot confirm the thought directly. What survives are compositions, names, hymns, and mythic scenes, not the private reflections of women in labour or of midwives at work. Still, the atmosphere persists. You move in thought through a dim inner room where a clay lamp burns with a small steady flame. A bowl of water sits nearby. Bundles of reeds rest against the wall. There is the scent of oil, linen, and warm dust. In this enclosed darkness, the origin of humanity does not feel like a public proclamation. It feels like a guarded act. Something is mixed. Something is spoken over. Something is brought from stillness into dangerous life. The masculine imagery of decree and labour gives way, for a moment, to another understanding. To create humanity is not only to assign purpose. It is to make a vulnerable body capable of carrying purpose. That vulnerability may be one of the most important hidden truths in the Sumerian imagination. Human beings are not fashioned from bronze or stone. They are made from soft earth. They leak, weaken, tire, age, and die. If divine substance enters them at all, it does not cancel fragility. It only complicates it. Perhaps that is why these myths linger so powerfully. They do not deny human weakness. They build it in from the beginning. Some have wondered whether this is the real forbidden element in the ancient origin story. Not that humans were made for labour, but that they were made precious and breakable at the same time, valuable enough to shape carefully, limited enough to remain dependent, strong enough to build cities, weak enough to return to mud. That is not a contradiction the myths try to resolve. It is a condition they seem to accept. Outside, the night remains vast and still. Inside, the little lamp burns beside bowl and wall, beside cloth and cradle, beside all the materials from which ordinary life is continually renewed. In that quiet room, with clay close at hand and birth, never far from thought. The old Mesopotamian question changes again. Humanity is not only what was assigned in heaven, humanity is what had to be carried into the world through matter, risk, and the hands of those who knew how to shape life in darkness. Just before dawn, work begins again. It begins quietly at first. A door opens. Sand scrapes under a sandal. Someone coughs in the cool air. In the dim blue light before sunrise, figures move through lanes with baskets, ropes, tools, and jars. A small fire is coaxed back to life. The smell of ash sharpens, joined by damp earth and the faint sour sweetness of fermenting grain. Donkeys shift under their loads. A woman sweeps a threshold. Somewhere in the dark, water is being lifted from a channel into a waiting container. There is nothing theatrical about it. The city simply resumes itself. Yet in this half-light, when labour starts before the sun is even visible, the old Mesopotamian claim that humanity was made for work no longer feels like metaphor alone. It feels like the atmosphere of existence. You begin to see why the myths speak as they do. The first workers under heaven were not imagined in comfort. They were imagined in function. Fields needed tending, dikes needed repair, temples needed provisioning, animals needed counting, grain needed storing, reeds needed cutting, bricks needed drying, cloth needed weaving, and canals needed endless maintenance. In southern Mesopotamia, irrigation was both a gift and a demand. Water made agriculture possible, but only if people organized themselves to guide, divide, repair, and defend it. This is one of the strongest grounded realities behind the old stories. Early complex society in the River Plain required coordinated labour on a scale that no isolated household could sustain for long. Collective work was not optional, it was civilizational. Ancient administrative tablets reflect this world with striking plainness. Ration lists, labour assignments, deliveries of barley and wool, inventories of livestock, and records tied to temple or palace economies show societies deeply concerned with managing human effort. It is easy to romanticize the first cities from a distance. It is harder to romanticize a ration tablet. Yet those tablets may tell you as much about humanity's imagined role as any myth does. They reveal a civilization that knew how to count labour, distribute subsistence, and absorb people into systems larger than themselves. So when myth says humans were made to relieve divine burden, it echoes something materially visible everywhere. You walk toward the fields as dawn thickens over the plain. The horizon turns from blue to pale bronze. Canal water catches the first weak light. Men and women are already out among the growing rows, carrying hoes, baskets, or seed. The earth near the channel is dark and damp, but only a short distance away it becomes crusted, pale and unforgiving. Agriculture here is never simply natural abundance. It is shaped water, measured water, water delayed, redirected, contained, or released. The field itself is an achievement. An achievement means labour remembered by no monument. There is a sober dignity in that, but also something unsettling. The human being in Mesopotamian imagination is often close to the field labourer, the carrier, the maintainer, the one whose work supports a larger sacred and social order. This does not mean everyone in the city lived the same life. There were priests, scribes, administrators, merchants, craftsmen, elite households, and rulers. Social differences were substantial, yet the baseline truth remained. Civilization rested on effort, and effort rested on human bodies. The myths seem to preserve that truth without much illusion. Some fringe readers have taken the labour emphasis as evidence that the texts encode a memory of humans created as a servant class by non-human rulers. Mainstream scholarship rejects such literalized theories, and the evidence does not justify them. The myths belong to literary and theological traditions, not secret biological records. Still, the persistence of the servant motif does force an uncomfortable reflection. Ancient Mesopotamian origin stories do not always begin by praising human freedom. They begin by locating human value inside usefulness. That can sound bleak until you look more closely at how usefulness was understood. Work in Mesopotamia was not only brute effort, it involved expertise, rhythm, ritual timing, and inherited technique. A brewer knew how grain should be prepared. A potter knew the touch of clay at different stages. A canal worker knew where water would cut through weak earth. A shepherd knew the danger of heat and disease. A scribe knew the arrangement of signs and accounts. A singer knew the correct performance of a lament or hymn. Human labour was skilled, differentiated, and deeply social. This complexity matters because the mythic worker is not a machine. The first human under heaven is a bearer of pattern. One grounded detail supports this. Archaeology and textual evidence show extensive craft specialization in Mesopotamian cities, from metallurgy and textile production to sealing practices and large-scale food processing. Urban life depended not merely on manpower, but on trained labour. A city could not function through raw strength alone. Knowledge had to be embodied in workers, passed through households, workshops, and institutions. Humanity's role, therefore, may have felt weighty precisely because humans carried civilization in their hands. The uncertainty lies in whether Mesopotamian myths meant labour to be an honour, a burden, or both. Scholars debate this because the tone varies. Some compositions emphasise the relief of divine toil as though humanity's purpose were fundamentally practical. Others allow more room for sacred participation and dignified service. Ritual offerings, songs, temple maintenance, and agricultural provision were not always imagined as humiliations. They could also be forms of cosmic cooperation. The line between servitude and belonging is not always clear in the texts. You feel that ambiguity as the sun rises fully. Workers bend to the field. Others move toward workshops. Smoke thickens from ovens and kilns. The city, viewed from slightly above, looks like an intricate organism whose life depends on countless acts too small to memorialize. It may be that this is what the myths were trying to say all along. Humanity's greatness, if the word applies, lies not in domination but in maintenance. People hold systems together. They keep time, carry matter, preserve names, and repair what would otherwise collapse. That idea takes on a deeper mood when joined to the temple world. Grain brought in from fields does not end only in household bread. Part of it enters sacred distribution. Animals are offered. Beer is poured. Bread is set before divine images. Incense burns. Musicians perform. Ritual calendars continue. The work of the field becomes the food of the gods in symbolic and material terms. Human labour feeds heaven, at least within the imagination of temple society. To be a worker under heaven is therefore not only to sweat under the sun, it is to stand inside a chain of exchange stretching from earth to altar. Perhaps that is why these myths refuse easy judgment. They do not say that labour is merely punishment. They also do not say it is simple fulfillment. They describe a world in which effort is the cost of order, and order is the condition of life. Some have wondered whether this preserved a dim memory of humanity's earlier social role, when the first large institutions began to absorb people into coordinated work beyond household scale. If so, the myths may carry not a literal secret, but an emotional truth about the birth of civilization, that the moment humans became truly collective, they also began to feel assigned. The sun climbs, shadows shorten, the field brightens into gold and dust. A worker wipes his brow with the back of his wrist. Another presses mud back into a weakened embankment. Another counts jars unloaded at a yard. The first workers under heaven are no longer mythic figures at all. They are simply people. That may be the strangest part of the old story. It takes the divine and the ordinary, the cosmic and the practical, and fits them together so tightly that each begins to explain the other. When the sun stands high again, human labour begins to cast a longer political shadow. The field does not remain only a field. The canal does not remain only water. The temple does not remain only a sacred enclosure. All of them begin to gather round another force, one the Mesopotamians treated with nearly the same seriousness as divine decree itself: kingship. Not kingship merely as a man wearing authority, but as a condition that seemed to enter the world from outside ordinary human choice. In the old king lists, one of the most memorable lines is simple and grand. Kingship descended from heaven. Few phrases do more work in fewer words. It turns government into inheritance, order into transmission, and the ruler into something more than a local strongman. It also deepens the mystery of human origin, because once kingship comes from above, human society appears to have been structured from the beginning by more than practical need. You walk in thought through a public square where walls are coated with sun-baked plaster and a platform rises beyond the clustered roofs. Officials move in and out of doorways. A scribe sits with tablet and stylus. A messenger arrives dusty from the road. Men carrying sealed containers pause for inspection. Over all of it hangs the fact that someone commands, someone allocates, someone speaks in the name of authority larger than household or workshop. In Mesopotamia, the ruler could be city lord, king, governor, builder, war leader, temple patron, or chosen servant of a deity, depending on period and place. Titles varied, and political structures changed over time. Yet the larger idea remained strikingly stable. Power was not imagined as purely negotiated. It was bestowed, sanctioned, and linked to cosmic order. One grounded historical detail is important here. Early Mesopotamian political authority did not emerge all at once in the later familiar form of empire. In the 4th and 3rd millennia, BCE power was distributed through city-based institutions, temple networks, and elite households in ways that scholars still debate. Some cities appear to have had strong temple-centered administrations, while others show increasing concentration of authority in rulers whose inscriptions emphasize building, war, and divine favor. The development of kingship was historical, gradual, and entangled with urban expansion, conflict, irrigation control, and redistribution. That complexity matters because it reminds you that the mythic language of kingship descending from heaven was being used by societies whose political arrangements were actively evolving. Still, the mythic phrase itself does something extraordinary. It places rule inside sacred time. The Sumerian king list is especially haunting in this regard. It presents a sequence of cities and rulers, some apparently historical, others overwhelmingly legendary, and it divides the world with the flood as a great break. Before that rupture come kings whose reigns stretch for impossible spans, tens of thousands of years in some manuscripts. After it, reign lengths shrink towards something more human. Mainstream scholarship generally sees this as literary ideology rather than literal chronology. The enormous numbers may signal remote antiquity, symbolic prestige, or the special status of primeval kings. That is the cautious and responsible reading, yet the emotional effect is unmistakable. The list suggests that rulership, and by extension human society itself, was once arranged on a scale no longer available to ordinary memory. This is where fringe curiosity often rushes in. Some have wondered whether the antediluvian kings preserved distorted recollections of actual forgotten eras, perhaps ruled by extraordinary beings or a separate order of humanity. Others suggest that the vast reigns reflect astronomical coding or sacred mathematics. There is little solid evidence for such dramatic conclusions, and most of them remain speculative at best. Yet the reason they continue to tempt readers is understandable. The text itself refuses normal proportion. It insists that the first phase of civilization belonged to a different register. Even if purely symbolic, the effect is to push accepted history outward and upward into something half concealed. You stand with that sensation for a while. The king list is not just a chronology. It is a theory of legitimacy. Cities receive kingship. Kingship moves from one city to another. The institution is not invented locally each time. It is transferred as though it were a sacred object or a power with its own continuity. That tells you something profound about Mesopotamian imagination. Human communities do not simply organize themselves and call it rule. Rule itself has an origin beyond them, and that matters for the story of humanity. If humans were created to serve within a divine order, then kingship may have been the social mechanism through which that order became visible on earth. The ruler stands between divine decree and collective labor, translating cosmic legitimacy into canals, walls, temples, taxes, military force, and seasonal stability. This does not mean kings were seen as gods in every Mesopotamian tradition. Often, they were better understood as chosen or favoured servants of the gods. But the distance between heaven and city was narrowed through them. Kingship became the hinge. Scholars remain divided over how to interpret the ideological force of these texts. Was the king list primarily a political tool produced to stabilise later claims? Very likely in part. Did it also preserve older conceptions of sacred rulership whose roots reached back into formative urban memory? Quite possibly. The difficulty is that literary ideology and inherited belief are not mutually exclusive. A text can legitimize present power, while also carrying ancient symbolic structures that its authors did not invent from scratch. The surviving sources do not always allow clean separation. The city around you makes this ambiguity feel natural. Near the temple precinct, official life appears almost liturgical. Storage, inspection, decree, offering, and procession all overlap. A ruler commissioning a canal or wall is doing something practical, but also something cosmological. He's helping keep order in place. Mesopotamian royal inscriptions often emphasize building projects, temple restoration, divine commissioning, and the ruler's duty toward sacred houses. Kingship was not imagined only as dominance, it was custodianship at scale. Still, one unusual detail lingers in the mind. In some primeval traditions, before the flood or near the edge of remembered time, kingship feels less like administration and more like possession of a world not yet fully human. The vast numbers, the sequence of cities, the transfer of rule from heaven to earth, all create the impression that ordinary people inherited civilization after it had already been shaped by something beyond them. That does not prove hidden rulers or lost epochs in any literal sense, but it does preserve a mood that is hard to dismiss. Humanity seems not to have begun alone. It entered a prearranged theatre of authority. By afternoon, the square grows hotter. The officials continue their work. Couriers arrive, clerks press signs into clay. A wall inscription names a ruler who built for the gods and secured the city. Everything seems grounded, visible, and practical. Yet under those visible things lies the oldest suggestion that structure itself descended from elsewhere. The city was not merely assembled by hands, it was given a pattern. Perhaps that is why Mesopotamian origins continue to feel so layered. The making of humanity is not only biological or mythic, it is political. To become human in a full civilizational sense is to enter hierarchy, duty, office, and divine mediation. Some have wondered whether the true hidden origin of humanity in these myths is not simply creation from clay, but initiation into obedience under a kingship whose source was never fully human to begin with. The sunlight hardens on the walls, the ruler's name dries into clay, the city continues beneath the logic of decree, and somewhere behind all of it remains that brief old line, simple enough to memorize, difficult enough to ponder for a lifetime. Kingship descended from heaven. By late afternoon, the light begins to thicken with dust, and water becomes harder to trust. What looked calm in the morning now glitters too brightly. Canal edges seem sharp, unstable. Mud along the bank has dried and cracked at the surface while remaining slick underneath, ready to pull at the foot. The same water that feeds barley, carries boats, cools jars, and softens clay also reminds you that Mesopotamia was built in a landscape where flood was never an abstract fear. Rivers changed course, embankments failed, fields drowned, settlements had to adapt. In such a world, a great flood did not need to be invented out of nowhere. It only needed to be remembered, magnified, ritualized, and placed at the center of cosmic history. This is what makes the Mesopotamian flood tradition so powerful. They feel both mythic and local. In the Atrahasis and in the flood section of the standard Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, humanity approaches a breaking point. The gods respond with devastation. One human survivor, warned in advance, builds a vessel and preserves life through the catastrophe. These are Akkadian literary forms preserved later than early Sumerian city origins. Yet they draw on older Mesopotamian ideas and motifs. There are also Sumerian flood traditions, including the figure of Ziusudra, whose story survives in damaged form. Scholars have long noted the deep significance of flood myth in the region, and not simply because of later comparisons with biblical tradition. In Mesopotamia, flood is a boundary event. It divides orders of time. It separates one world from another. You stand in thought on a raised embankment and look out over the plain. The field geometry that once seemed orderly now appears vulnerable. A single breach in the wrong place could turn pattern into ruin. Mud brick walls, for all their usefulness, do not resist prolonged water well. Granaries can be spoiled, roads vanish, reeds tear loose and gather in heavy floating mats. Livestock panic. The river plain gives life generously, but never without condition. That environmental truth helps explain why flood in Mesopotamian imagination is not merely punishment. It is reset. One grounded historical detail matters here. Archaeological evidence does not support a single universal flood covering the whole ancient world. But local and regional flood deposits have been found at various Mesopotamian sites, and catastrophic inundation would have been a repeated reality across generations in riverine settlements. Different cities preserved different flood memories, and the material record does not point to one neat event that matches every mythic account. This is exactly the kind of situation in which myth grows. Real disasters occur, are remembered, retold, merged, enlarged, and eventually placed inside sacred narrative as the decisive break that explains why the world is no longer what it once was. That break is what gives the flood its strange spiritual force. Before the flood, the kingless speak in one register. After the flood, they speak in another. Before the flood, durations are vast, almost non-human. After the flood, time begins to narrow. Before the flood, the world feels close to primeval order. After the flood, it becomes recognizably historical. This is not the language of meteorology. It is the language of separation. The Mesopotamian imagination places a wall of water between two modes of existence. Naturally, that has encouraged more speculative readings. Some fringe interpreters argue that the flood traditions preserve a memory of a destroyed earlier civilization, or of humanity being reduced and restarted under altered conditions. Mainstream scholarship does not endorse such claims in any literal form, and the texts themselves remain literary, theological, and symbolic rather than technical reports. Still, there is something in the tone of these narratives that invites the thought: the flood does not merely kill, it interrupts continuity. It creates a before and after so severe that the earlier order survives only in damaged remembrance. You feel that most strongly in the figure of the survivor. Whether Ziusudra, Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim, depending on the tradition, the preserved human being is never just lucky. He becomes a container of continuity, seeds, animals, craftsmen in some later retellings, family, memory, divine instruction. All are gathered into a vessel and carried through destruction. This image is more than survival. It is controlled transmission. The human race is not allowed to vanish completely, but neither is it allowed to continue unchanged. Something passes through the flood, and something does not. Scholars continue to debate how the various flood traditions relate to each other, how early the motifs are, and what local or literary conditions shaped each version. There is also debate about how much direct continuity should be assumed between Sumerian, Akkadian, and later retellings. The materials are connected but not identical. This uncertainty is important because it prevents the flood from becoming too simple. There was no single, monolithic Mesopotamian doctrine on the matter. There were stories, variants, emphases, and inherited symbols arranged differently over time. Even so, one pattern remains consistent enough to matter. The flood stands between forms of humanity. That idea can be approached gently. It may be that the flood myths express the ancient recognition that every civilization lives after loss. No city remembers its full beginning, no archive survives whole, no language remains fixed forever. The flood then becomes a sacred metaphor for cultural amnesia itself, the event that leaves enough behind to continue but never enough to restore the original condition. That is a sober reading, and well within the logic of ancient literature. And yet some have wondered whether the deeper unsettling suggestion is that humanity after the flood is not quite the same humanity as before. Lifespans shrink, order changes, cities reappear under altered conditions, memory grows thinner. If taken symbolically, this may reflect the ordinary human experience that distant ancestors always seem larger, stronger, wiser, or closer to the gods. But even as symbolism, it leaves a residue of unease. The flood becomes the moment when access narrows, when the first design is partially withdrawn. A curious historical detail adds texture here. Mesopotamian flood narratives often include careful technical instructions for boat building, measurements, sealing, loading, and weighting. Details that make the stories feel practical even when the scale becomes impossible. This blend of craft realism and cosmic upheaval is characteristic of the tradition. Disaster is narrated through ordinary skills: wood cutting, waterproofing, storing, enduring. Even at the edge of annihilation, survival depends on workmanship. The human being remains a maker. The sun drops lower, red light spreads across shallow water and makes it look almost metallic. Birds circle over marsh vegetation. The air cools, but the tension remains. You realize that flood in these myths is not only about judgment or cleansing, it is about interruption, selection, and fragile continuation. Humanity is allowed to remain, but under changed skies and with a shorter memory. So the forbidden origin of humanity grows stranger again. It is not simply that humans were shaped from clay and assigned labour. It may also be that the human story, as preserved in myth, begins after a great forgetting, after the first arrangement was broken and only a reduced version carried through. The waters rise, the old order recedes, and what remains afloat is not certainty, but a few names, a vessel, and the quiet implication that the earliest world was larger than the one that followed. After the flood, what remains is never the whole pattern. That thought settles over the evening like fine dust. The city is intact enough to function. Walls stand, fires burn, priests recite, boats unload reeds and jars at the landing. Yet in your mind the world has changed, not because the people moving through it know less in any ordinary sense, but because you have begun to feel how much of their deepest inheritance may already have reached them in pieces. A civilization can be brilliant and still live among fragments. It can calculate, legislate, build, sing, and preserve, while quietly lacking the full original sequence of the stories that tell it who it is. That is one of the most striking truths about the Mesopotamian record. So much survives, and yet so much survives broken. A tablet is missing its first column. Another preserves only the middle of a speech. A myth known from one site overlaps imperfectly with a version from another. A bilingual lexical list clarifies one divine name but complicates another. A composition survives in old Babylonian copies though its Sumerian original is lost. Sometimes a text is reconstructed from scattered fragments, discovered decades apart and joined only through painstaking comparison of script, grammar, and context. Assyriology often advances not by grand revelations but by fragments finding each other again. The past returns in shards. You sit in imagination in a quiet archive room where baskets of tablets stand sorted by size, subject, or school tradition. Some are neatly inscribed, others are broken lumps whose surfaces carry only a few readable signs. A careful hand lifts one, tilts it toward the light, moistens nothing, rushes nothing, and tries to hear through the damage. This is how much of ancient humanity's first story has come down to the modern world, not as a single preserved manuscript, but as a field of partial survivals. One grounded historical detail gives weight to this. Major Mesopotamian literary and scholarly traditions are known through thousands of clay tablets recovered from sites such as Nippur, Nineveh, Sippar, Ur, and others. But most texts are incomplete. Many compositions are reconstructed from multiple exemplars. Some survive in school tablets, others in library copies, still others in isolated fragments with uncertain provenance. The picture is rich, yet constantly provisional. Every claim about the oldest myths is shaped by gaps. That would be true enough for any ancient literature, but in the case of human origins it becomes especially haunting. When the texts that explain humanity's beginning arrive in damaged form, the damage itself starts to feel meaningful. A lost line may once have named a motive. A missing edge may have held the relation between two gods. An uncertain verb may shift a whole scene from creation to alteration, from gift to command, from formation to repair. Scholars are often admirably restrained in such cases. marking broken sections carefully and resisting the urge to invent certainty. Yet for the reflective mind, those lacunae become part of the mood. The beginning of humanity is literally incomplete in the record. Some have wondered whether this incompleteness reflects more than accident. Did ancient scribes sometimes choose not to preserve certain material? Were older sequences already broken in their time? Did temple and school traditions favour particular strands of myth while letting others fade? These are legitimate questions, though firm answers are rare. Text loss can result from ordinary factors: fragile archives, changing literary tastes, political collapse, environmental damage, lack of copying. There is no need to imagine deliberate concealment in every case. Still, literary survival is never neutral. What gets recopied lives, what is neglected dies. In that sense, every tradition hides as much by forgetting as by refusing. This is where fringe speculation often enters with unusual energy. Some readers imagine missing tablets containing forbidden truths about the creation of humanity, suppressed because later priesthoods or rulers found them dangerous. There is little direct evidence for such dramatic suppression, and most lost material was probably lost through the ordinary cruelty of time. Yet the speculation feeds on something real. Mesopotamian myth often feels as though it once belonged to a larger sequence now out of reach. The surviving tablets do not always begin where you would expect, nor do they always explain the relations among their own episodes. The record is textured by absence. You begin to see the ancient world less as a library and more as a ruin. A ruin is not empty. It is arranged in completeness. Enough remains to show intention. Not enough remains to restore life exactly as it was. That is true of the walls, temples, and inscriptions. But it is also true of stories. When you read Sumerian or Akkadian creation material through modern translations and scholarly notes, you're standing among narrative foundations. Some rooms can be entered, others are marked only by thresholds. A few have collapsed so fully that only scattered bricks tell you they existed at all. Scholars remain divided on the reconstruction of specific mythic sequences, partly because the fragments allow multiple plausible paths. Which line belongs where? Does a damaged divine epithet refer to one goddess or another? Was a particular composition performed ritually, copied pedagogically, or both? Did a myth evolve from local cult tradition into broader literary form, or was it assembled from older floating motifs? These questions matter because the hidden origin of humanity may lie not in any single text, but in the spaces between texts. Reconstruction is interpretation. A curious detail deepens the feeling. In Mesopotamian scribal culture, copying itself was a form of preservation and transformation. A student or master did not photograph a text. He rewrote it by hand into fresh clay, often in a new context and period. Mistakes could enter, clarifications could be made. Archaic forms could be preserved long after their everyday meaning faded. The living chain of transmission therefore carried both fidelity and change. What survives is not untouched antiquity, but curated continuity. Perhaps that is why the origin story seems to recede whenever you approach it too directly. The closer you move to the first sequence, the more you find layers of handling. A scribe chose this version. A school preserved that excerpt. A city favoured one deity's role. Another tradition elevated a different one. A fragment was broken before it was buried. Another was found, but remains unjoined. Human beginnings in Mesopotamian myth are therefore not hidden behind one locked door. They are scattered across many half-open rooms. The evening darkens, lamplight returns. In the scribal room of your imagination, someone smooths fresh clay for a copy of an old text whose older copy was itself incomplete. The work continues in humility. No one in that room has the full beginning either. They preserve what they can. They repeat what remains. They trust that broken sequence is better than silence. And perhaps that is the most revealing thing of all. A civilization does not preserve fragments unless it senses that fragments still carry power. Even damaged beginnings matter. Even missing lines still shape belief. Some have wondered whether the real secret of human origin in the Sumerian world is not contained in a lost master tablet, but in the pattern created by all the surviving breaks. Humanity appears as something remembered incompletely on purpose, or by fate, a story too old to survive whole, but too important to disappear entirely. Outside, the city settles into another night. Inside, Clay waits for another impressed line. The sequence remains lost, yet in its brokenness, it continues to speak. There are moments in old myth when humanity does not seem to be the first answer. The night has grown deeper, but not entirely silent. Wind passes over the flat roofs with a dry whisper. Reeds at the canal edge rub against one another like the pages of a book being turned very slowly. In a temple courtyard, a lamp is still burning for reasons that do not belong to sleep. It is at this hour that the boundaries between categories begin to soften. God and servant, creature and attendant, human and pre-human. The old Mesopotamian stories do not always describe a clean world in which ordinary mankind appears immediately at the centre. Instead, they hint at populations, ranks, and presences that occupy the space between divine order and everyday humanity. You feel this most clearly in the crowded texture of their cosmology. Mesopotamian religion was never populated only by the great gods. Around the major deities moved attendants, messengers, gatekeepers, protective beings, monsters. Apkallu figures associated in later tradition with primeval wisdom, and a whole range of intermediate presences that do not fit comfortably into modern categories. Some were feared, some were protective, some were attached to ritual spaces, thresholds, or divine households. Others were remembered through lists, incantations, and visual forms. The world was layered. Human beings did not inhabit it alone with the gods watching from far away. They lived within a more populated sacred ecology. A grounded historical detail helps anchor this. Mesopotamian art, ritual texts, incantation literature, and omen traditions preserve many kinds of non-human or partly human figures, from protective Apkallu and composite guardians in later Assyrian contexts to earlier mythic beings tied to specific stories and divine households. Not all of these beings belong to the earlier Sumerian creation traditions in the same way, and scholars are careful about projecting later iconography too neatly backward, yet the general principle remains solid. Mesopotamian thought allowed for many forms of ordered life besides ordinary human society. That matters because when a culture imagines multiple classes of being, the origin of humanity becomes less straightforward. Humans may not have been the first servants, the first intelligences, or even the first dwellers in sacred space. They may have emerged into a world already occupied by older ranks with other functions. This possibility is often felt rather than explicitly stated, but it gives the myths a strange depth. Humanity begins to look less like the first experiment and more like one phase within a longer sequence of beings. Some readers have found this especially compelling in relation to the Apkallu, the antediluvian sages known more clearly from later Mesopotamian tradition. These figures are associated with wisdom, culture, and instruction, sometimes represented as fish-cloaked or otherwise unusual in visual form. Mainstream scholarship tends to interpret them within the framework of scholarly lore, kingship ideology, and protective ritual symbolism, rather than as literal pre-human species. That is the careful and reasonable approach. Still, their existence in the tradition encourages a powerful question. If civilization had sages before ordinary humanity appears in full historical clarity, what kind of world did those sages belong to? You walk in thought through a temple storage court where carved or moulded figures stand at thresholds, part symbolic, part protective. Their form's not wholly human, their function is not personal freedom, it is guarding, mediating, marking sacred boundaries. In such a world, the idea that there were beings before ordinary mankind no longer feels outrageous. It feels almost expected. Great houses have attendants. Great gods do too. Sacred order multiplies roles. Scholars remain uncertain how closely to connect different classes of beings across the very long span of Mesopotamian religious history. A protective figure in first millennium Assyria cannot simply be treated as evidence for a specific 3rd millennium Sumerian belief without caution. Traditions evolved, local cults differed, names shifted, literary motifs wandered and were repurposed. Yet the recurrent presence of intermediate beings does suggest that Mesopotamian imagination was comfortable with graded existence. Not everything that served the gods was fully human in the everyday sense. This becomes even more interesting when combined with the creation of humanity for labour and ritual service. If humans were made to carry burdens once borne by others, who were those others? In some traditions, the labouring beings are themselves divine or semi-divine workers whose complaint leads to the making of humans. That is already a kind of before. The first burden bearers are not men and women of the field, but prior workers in the divine economy. The language remains mythic, of course, and should not be forced into literal anthropology. Still, one reading of the text implies sequence. Service existed before humanity, and humanity inherited it. That idea has long attracted fringe interpretations. Some have imagined an earlier servant race, a partly forgotten class of engineered beings, or an order of attendants replaced by mankind when circumstances changed. The evidence for such literal claims is weak, and serious scholarship does not require them, but their emotional appeal comes from a genuine feature of the source material. Humanity often feels secondary in the cosmic order. Needed? Yes. Important? Yes. But not primordial. The stage seems already furnished when humans enter. A curious historical tidbit adds to the atmosphere. Mesopotamian lexical lists and scholarly texts often delighted in categorization, naming not only ordinary professions and animals but also unusual beings, divine roles, and hybrid forms. This passion for ordered naming reflects a culture that saw classification itself as a kind of mastery. A world so richly categorized could easily imagine existence as populated by many layers beyond the visible human one. To name is to acknowledge place. A Mesopotamian tradition named more than the ordinary world. You begin to wonder whether the forbidden aspect of human origin lies partly here, not in the claim that humans came from nowhere, but in the suggestion that they came late, that others stood closer to the first design, that wisdom, guardianship, or sacred service may have existed in forms not fully human before ordinary mankind took up its assigned place. If so, then humanity's origin is hidden not by secrecy, but by hierarchy. The nearer one stands to the beginning, the less human the figures become. In the temple night, that thought settles softly. A threshold guarded by a symbolic being. A priest speaking names that ordinary workers do not hear. A legend of primeval sages attached to antediluvian kings. A memory of divine labour preceding human labour. None of this proves a lost race in any material sense, but together these details suggest that Mesopotamian myth imagined a populated prehistory, a sacred background full of ranks and attendants before the familiar human city took shape. Perhaps that is why the stories of human making carry such tension. Humans are clay and divine mixture, workers and worshippers, but also replacements, successors, late arrivals to an older arrangement. It may be that what the myths preserve most faithfully is not the technical fact of how humans were formed, but the emotional truth that the world did not begin with them. They entered something already ancient, already administered, already inhabited by powers and presences not easily reduced to ordinary life. The lamp in the courtyard burns lower. Wind stirs dust against the base of a wall. Above, the sky is full of stars that seem older than any temple, any city, any written sign. And under that sky the ancient imagination leaves open a quiet possibility. Before ordinary mankind walked the floodplain carrying baskets, tablets, and offerings, other beings may have stood nearer the first thresholds of order, their memory surviving only as hints in lists, myths, and the watchful silence of guarded gates. By the hour before dawn, memory itself begins to feel like a guarded room. The city sleeps in layers. Common houses lie dark and still. Courtyard embers glow faintly under ash. Animals shift in pens and settle again. But there are places where wakefulness continues by duty, and those places change the meaning of the night. A temple chamber where oil must still be tended, a scribal room where tablets rest in ordered stacks, a sanctuary where the divine image, though unseen behind curtains or doors, remains the centre of an invisible household. In such spaces, the old stories do not circulate freely like market gossip or children's songs. They are preserved, repeated, interpreted, and sometimes transformed by those entrusted with sacred and scholarly care. This is where origin becomes institution. You begin to understand that what survives from Mesopotamia is not just what was once spoken, but what was once curated. Priests, temple personnel, scribes, diviners, lamentation singers, ritual specialists, and learned officials all played roles in preserving the intellectual and religious life of the civilization. The exact relationship between priesthood and scribal education varied across periods and cities, and scholars rightly avoid turning these roles into one single timeless class. Even so, the general picture is clear enough. Access to sacred texts, technical rituals, omen series, lexical lists, hymns, and learned traditions was not evenly shared. Knowledge lived inside institutions. It had keepers. A grounded historical detail makes this plain. Mesopotamian temples were not simply places of worship in a narrow sense. They were major centers of storage, labor organization, offering practice, and in many contexts of textual and ritual continuity. Scribal education, though not identical to priesthood, often operated in close relation to institutional life, and the preservation of myths depended on copying traditions maintained by trained literate specialists. What you know of human origins in Mesopotamian literature comes through those channels. That means the ancient story of humanity was already filtered when it reached clay. A priest or scribe did not approach a tablet as a modern neutral archivist. He belonged to a system of reverence, authority, and inherited categories. If he copied a myth, he did so within the expectations of language, education, cult, and legitimacy available to him. Certain divine names mattered more in one city than another. Certain stories were useful in ritual. Certain old forms were preserved because they carried prestige. Others may have faded because they no longer served the living structure of temple and school. In this sense, memory was guarded not necessarily by censorship alone, but by relevance. And yet the possibility of stronger guarding cannot be dismissed entirely. Some have wondered whether the most unsettling parts of ancient origin traditions may have been softened, reorganized, or left uncopied once temple systems became more stable and politically tied to kingship. That idea is difficult to prove. Most lost texts are probably lost through ordinary historical erosion, neglect, collapse, reuse of space, changing language, broken archives. Still, when you study a civilization where sacred legitimacy and institutional order mattered so much, the question naturally appears: did memory survive whole, or only in forms acceptable to those who preserved it? Scholars remain cautious here, as they should. There is little direct evidence of a priestly conspiracy to suppress a forbidden anthropology, but there is abundant evidence that traditions were transmitted selectively. What schools taught, what temples recited, what scholars commented on, and what rulers patronized all influenced survival. Literary history is never passive. It is shaped by the priorities of the hands that copy. You can almost see this process in the room before you. A senior scribe sits cross-legged beneath lamplight. Around him are tablets of different sizes, some school exercises, some lexical, some literary, some ritual. A younger student waits, stylus in hand, ready to copy dictated lines. There is discipline in the air. Words are not casual here. A divine name must be written correctly. A broken sign must be inferred with training, not guesswork. The room smells of warm clay, oil smoke, and reed. This is a workshop of preservation, but also of narrowing. What enters the next generation does so through form. That form matters deeply when the subject is human origin. A creation myth copied in a temple scribal environment is likely to be heard through theological and institutional ears. Humanity may be described as servant because temple service structures society. Kingship may descend from heaven because the city depends on sacred hierarchy. Flood may mark a boundary because ritual memory needs a cosmic break. None of this makes the myths false. It means they are living within systems of interpretation. A curious detail makes the atmosphere even stranger. In Mesopotamian scholarly culture, learned knowledge could be both practical and guarded. Omen texts, ritual instructions, healing incantations, liturgical compositions, and lexical traditions all required specialized training. Knowledge was powerful because it was correct, inherited, and controlled. The very existence of esoteric expertise in such a world suggests that some meanings were not for everyone. Even if myths of creation were publicly known in broad outline, deeper interpretive layers may have belonged mainly to the trained. This does not require deliberate concealment in the dramatic modern sense. It may simply reflect an old truth. The more sacred and technical a tradition becomes, the fewer people carry it fully. A farmer might know the shape of a myth. A lamentation priest might know its ritual use. A master scribe might know its archaic signs and variant lines. The same story lives differently at each level. You begin to wonder whether this is why the oldest questions never arrive cleanly. Not because they were hidden behind stone doors, but because sacred memory naturally contracts into custodial communities. Priests and scholars do not only preserve origin, they mediate it. They decide which version counts as authoritative enough to copy, which divine relationship to emphasize, which damaged line to restore cautiously, which old phrase to leave in respected obscurity. In their hands, the beginning of humanity becomes both safer and harder to reach. One unusual fringe possibility lingers here too. Some readers suspect that later learned traditions inherited fragments of a much older story, whose original social setting had vanished entirely. Perhaps a pre-urban or proto-urban myth, remembered only in stylized temple language. Mainstream scholarship cannot confirm so large a claim, but it is not unreasonable to say that many preserved texts probably contain elements older than their written forms. The guarded room may therefore be holding something it does not fully understand, something already ancient when first copied. The eastern horizon is beginning to pale very slightly now, though the city does not yet know it, inside the guarded spaces. The night continues according to sacred routine. A tablet is wrapped, a lamp is trimmed, a reciter murmurs a line under his breath to keep it exact. No one there thinks of himself as hiding the origin of humanity. He thinks of himself as preserving what must not be lost. And perhaps that is the most delicate irony of all. Memory is rarely hidden by those who love it. It is shaped by them, protected, ordered, sanctified, and transmitted in forms that can survive the next generation. But every such act of protection changes the thing preserved a little. The farther back the story goes, the more hands it passes through, and the more the original pulse recedes behind the dignity of custody. So the forbidden origin of humanity may not have been buried under deliberate silence. It may have been placed on a shelf, copied into school tradition, absorbed into temple logic, and carried forward by careful men who guarded the words while gradually losing the first world that made the words necessary. When dawn is still only a rumour, the question changes once more. No longer who made humanity, no longer even why. The deeper and more difficult question becomes what kind of being was actually intended. The streets are silent at this hour, but silence can sharpen thought. In the half-dark, with the city not yet awake enough to distract itself, human life appears in outline rather than detail. A sleeping body on a roof beneath a woven blanket, a hand hanging loose over the side of a pallet, a child curled against an older relative, a watchman leaning on a spear, trying not to drift into dreams. Flesh at rest looks humble, almost temporary, and yet these same bodies will soon rise to speak, count, judge, sing, build, and remember. That tension between fragility and capacity may be the real centre of the ancient mystery. The old Mesopotamian traditions do not describe humanity as simple. They describe humans as clay. Yes, but not only clay. As workers, yes, but not only workers. As servants, yes, but also as bearers of language, ritual, memory, and skill. When you gather the pieces together, a more unsettling picture begins to form. Humanity may have been shaped with limits built in and capacities granted selectively. Not an unfinished creature, but a deliberately bounded one, capable enough to sustain cities and cults, limited enough to remain dependent, close enough to the divine order to serve it, far enough from it never to master it. One grounded historical detail helps here. Mesopotamian texts and iconography repeatedly show a world obsessed with proper boundaries, city and wilderness, pure and impure, sacred and ordinary, licensed knowledge and dangerous disorder. Ritual life often aimed to restore or protect right arrangement. In such a civilization, it would make sense for the human itself to be imagined as a bounded design, not an open-ended being. Human nature was not simply what happened. It occupied a defined place within a larger map of powers and permissions. That thought becomes more compelling when you consider knowledge. Humans in Mesopotamian myth and practice possess extraordinary abilities compared with the rest of the visible animal world. They speak formal prayer, they learn writing, they calculate offerings, they observe omens, they build monumental structures with planned geometry. They preserve genealogies and legal obligations. They can imagine the gods and serve them through symbolic acts. Yet the myths also imply that certain forms of wisdom remain beyond them, held more fully by divine beings or guarded specialists. The human being is therefore neither ignorant nor fully initiated. It is a middle condition. Some have wondered whether this middle condition is the real hidden design, that humanity was shaped not merely for work, but for managed awareness, enough consciousness to participate in order, but not enough to see the whole architecture, enough skill to maintain civilization, but not enough freedom to escape dependence. This remains speculative. Of course, the texts do not present a single doctrine of cognitive limitation. Yet one reading of the myths and institutions together suggests that bounded knowledge may be part of what it means to be human in Mesopotamian thought. The fringe imagination often pushes this further. It asks whether ancient stories preserve a memory that humanity once possessed greater capacities, which were then reduced, sealed, or restricted after some primeval rupture. Mainstream scholarship cannot confirm such an idea, and it goes well beyond what the evidence securely supports. But the reason the thought persists is not purely fantasy. The flood traditions, the primeval sages, the guarded me, the selective transmission of sacred knowledge, and the repeated emphasis on divine decree all create an atmosphere in which reduction feels imaginable. The surviving human seems like an edited human. You walk through a narrow lane as the faintest grey enters the eastern sky. The walls are cool to the touch. Plaster flakes slightly under your fingertips. A door is marked by old seal impressions where clay once held rope closures in place. Seals are small things, but they reveal something important. Mesopotamian society loved controlled access. Storage rooms were sealed, containers were marked, transactions were witnessed. Identity itself could be pressed into clay and leave an authorized sign. It is difficult not to notice how similar this is to the larger symbolic structure of their myths. The world is accessible, but not entirely open. Things are permitted, bounded, and recorded. Scholars remain divided on how directly one should connect social mechanisms of control with creation mythology. It would be too simple to say that, because administrative life was regulated, human nature was therefore imagined as deliberately restricted. Culture is not so mechanical. Still, the parallel is suggestive. A society that structures access, role, and duty so carefully may be especially inclined to imagine humanity itself as an office with conditions. The unusual detail that lingers here is the Mesopotamian fascination with destiny and decree. Gods assign fates, kings receive rule, cities have ordained standing, ritual restores disturbed order. This is not a world that celebrates unlimited self-invention. It is a world that worries about misalignment. If humans were made within such a cosmos, then perhaps their shape included more than body. It included permitted scope. That does not have to sound grim. There is tenderness in limits too. A bounded thing can be held, A measured life can belong. The sleeping city around you is not miserable because it is ordered. It is survivable because it is. The canal must stay in its banks. The bread must be baked at the right hour. The offering must be presented correctly. The roof beams must bear only what they can bear. To have form is to endure. Perhaps the ancient imagination saw humanity the same way, not as stunted, but as shaped for a place. And yet something remains quietly uncomfortable, because the myths never entirely erase the sense that humans contain more than their official role explains. Why give clay such inwardness? Why fashion labourers who dream, mourn, calculate, desire, pray, and ask where they came from? Why mix divine substance, however understood, into matter if mere utility was the only goal? Some have wondered whether this excess is the hidden sign that humanity was designed for more than service, even if later traditions could not say openly what that more might be. Again, the sources do not settle the question, but they do preserve the tension. The first birds begin to sound from the reed beds beyond the city edge. A faint chill rides above the canal water. Soon doors will open, fires will rise, and ordinary life will return to motion. For the moment, though, the world still belongs to threshold thinking, and in that threshold, the shape of humanity seems almost visible. Not a final answer, but a silhouette, bounded, burdened, intelligent, fragile, purposeful, and curiously incomplete. Perhaps that incompleteness is the forbidden part. Not that humans were made badly, but that they were made with margin, room enough to obey, room enough to wonder, never enough to stop wondering. The Mesopotamian myths do not accuse the gods of cruelty. They simply leave you with the impression that the human design was never meant to be fully transparent to the human being living inside it. By the time the first true light touches the upper edges of the walls, the thought has become very soft. You are clay given consciousness, perhaps on purpose, perhaps with conditions, perhaps as part of an order that needed both your hands and your uncertainty. And the old stories, careful and broken as they are, may still be whispering that the most hidden thing about human origin is not where you came from, but how deliberately your limits were shaped. At first light, the city looks older than it did in darkness. The roofs, walls, and lanes reappear not as abstractions, but as surfaces worn by time. Plaster is patched in several colours. Brick courses sag slightly where repairs were made in different seasons. Doorways carry the polished shine left by many hands. Even before people fully emerge into the streets, the city reveals a basic truth. Nothing here is entirely original. Everything has been inherited, repaired, renamed, and used again. That same truth belongs to the myths. By the time many of the best-known Mesopotamian compositions were written in Akkadian, copied in Babylonian schools, or preserved in Assyrian libraries, the Sumerian beginning was already an old inheritance living under new voices. This is one of the most fascinating parts of the story. The origin of humanity did not remain sealed inside one language, one city, or one generation of priests. It travelled. Sumerian religious thought deeply influenced later Akkadian-speaking societies, and over time stories, divine identities, and cosmological patterns were adapted, translated, and reinterpreted. Gods kept some of their functions while taking on new emphases. Texts moved between languages, literary forms changed. The world of Babylon and later Assyria was not a rejection of Sumer, but a continuation layered with transformation. If you want to understand how old ideas survived, you have to watch how they changed. A grounded historical detail makes this clear. Sumerian remained important long after it ceased to be an everyday spoken language, especially in scholarly and liturgical contexts, much as Latin functioned in later parts of Europe. Akkadian became dominant in speech and administration across much of Mesopotamia, yet scribes continued to study and copy Sumerian texts. This means that later Babylonian and Assyrian intellectual life did not simply replace older mythic traditions. It curated them, translated them, and folded them into new cultural frameworks. The result is continuity with distortion, preservation with reinterpretation. You feel that process in the divine names themselves. Enki becomes closely associated with Ea. Inanna and Ishtar overlap while retaining meaningful distinctions in different contexts. Primeval motifs do not vanish. They broaden. A later audience hearing of creation, flood, kingship, or sacred order may be encountering a story whose bones are Sumerian, whose language is Akkadian, and whose present meaning has been adjusted by centuries of new theology and political need. The myths, like the cities, are rebuilt on older foundations. That rebuilding can make the human origin story both clearer and stranger. In later Akkadian literature, especially works like Atrahasis, some themes become more explicit in narrative form. The creation of humanity as a response to divine labour burden appears in a more developed literary structure. The flood is integrated into a large sequence of human population, noise, divine reaction, and survival. This does not mean later texts are more original. It means they often preserve narrative arrangements more fully than the fragmentary earlier material available to us. Yet with fuller narrative comes another complication. A later text may clarify an old motif while also reframing it to suit its own era. That is where scholarly caution becomes essential. Did Babylonian authors preserve Sumerian creation ideas faithfully, or reshape them through their own political and theological worlds? The answer is likely both. Scholars remain divided on the degree of continuity for specific motifs, because parallels can show inheritance without proving identical meaning. A theme that begins in one setting may serve a different purpose in another. The old story lives, but it does not remain still. Some have found this shift in continuity deeply suggestive. Fringe-minded readers sometimes argue that later Mesopotamian empires carried forward dimmed knowledge of a much older forbidden origin, preserving its outlines while losing its full force. Mainstream scholarship would phrase this more carefully. It is reasonable to say that ancient traditions often conserve older structures in transformed form. It is far less reasonable to claim they secretly encoded a precise lost history. Even so, the feeling persists because the later texts often sound like echoes from a room whose original shape can no longer be seen. The sound is there. The walls are guessed. You move through a Babylonian scribal house in imagination. The air is warm already. Shelves or baskets hold tablets in ordered groups. A learned teacher calls out a Sumerian line and then explains its Akkadian equivalent. Students repeat, compare, copy. This scene is not just educational, it is civilizational memory in motion. An origin myth is no longer merely inherited. It is interpreted through bilingual scholarship. The old language becomes sacred and learned. The new language carries living power. Between them stands the scribe, half historian, half priest of continuity. A curious detail deepens the atmosphere. Mesopotamian scholarly culture loved commentarial activity before formal commentary existed in later familiar forms. Lexical lists, bilingual pairings, learned equivalences, and careful copying created a world in which preserving old words often meant surrounding them with explanatory structure. In such a system, mystery could survive not by remaining untouched, but by being taught. The more ancient a line, the more learned attention it attracted, and sometimes the more obscured its first setting became. This matters because the forbidden origin of humanity may have survived most successfully not in pure unchanged myth, but in adaptation. A story can remain dangerous enough to preserve while becoming safe enough to transmit. A god can keep his old depths while receiving a newer name. A creation scene can continue to unsettle while being wrapped in later literary polish. The old Mesopotamian world understood that continuity depends on form, and form always changes. As the day brightens, the city fills with language. Orders are spoken, names are called, buyers haggle, priests chant, scribes recite old signs no one speaks at home. You hear within this layered soundscape the larger truth of Akkad and Babylon. Civilizations do not inherit the past as silence. They inherit it as translation. And translation is never innocent. It preserves while selecting, clarifying while narrowing, extending while transforming. Perhaps that is why the Sumerian origin of humanity feels more haunting in its later echoes than it would have in any single lost original. You do not hear one voice. You hear many, overlapping across centuries, a creation from clay, a burden relieved, a flood survived, a kingship transferred, a hidden wisdom guarded. Each motif returns in altered light, as though later Mesopotamia kept turning the old figure slightly to see which parts would still catch the sun. Some have wondered whether the most important hidden truths were not erased but diluted, spread so widely across retellings that no one version retained the whole force. That is a speculation, not a proof. Yet it captures something emotionally accurate about long tradition. What is oldest often survives everywhere and nowhere at once. Too dispersed to recover completely, too persistent to disappear, by full morning, the rebuilt city is entirely awake. Merchants move, priests attend, students repeat ancient forms whose first speakers have been dust for ages, and among all these voices, the origin of humanity continues in echo. Not fixed in one tablet, not confined to one language, but living through Akkad, Babylon, and beyond as a transmitted unease, a sense that the first design of human life was both remembered and softened by those who carried it forward. By mid-morning, the ground begins to harden again, and archaeology returns to the story. Not archaeology as a lecture or museum label, but archaeology as a patient confrontation with what the earth will and will not release. A mound under sun, a trench line cut through layers of occupation, a trowel scraping compact soil, a brush lifting dust from a bone fragment or seal impression, string grids stretched across an excavation square, buckets of dirt hauled away a little at a time. The work is slow, repetitive, and humble, and perhaps that is why it feels so close to the ancient world itself. The first cities rose through endless handling of mud, brick, basket, and reed. The modern search for their hidden origins rises through equally careful handling, except now the task is not to build a wall or canal, but to read the remains of worlds that no longer speak for themselves. One grounded historical truth must be kept in view. Mesopotamia has given archaeology extraordinary riches, from monumental architecture and administrative tablets to seals, burials, figurines, botanical remains, and neighbourhood plans. Excavations at sites such as Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, Kish, and many others have transformed knowledge of early urban life. Chronologies have been refined, trade networks traced, agricultural systems reconstructed, ritual spaces identified. Yet no excavation has uncovered a single clear origin chamber of humanity. There is no buried room where the first design was written out plainly. What the earth gives is always partial. That partiality matters more than it first seems. You stand in imagination at the edge of an excavation trench while sun strikes the exposed mud brick sections below. The layers are visible, one wall cut by another, one floor laid over the collapse of an earlier room, ash bands, pits, rebuildings, surfaces hardened by use. A city appears here as accumulated choice and accumulated forgetting. Even when archaeology is at its most successful, it recovers phases rather than totality. The ground reveals sequences, but not complete motives. You can learn what people built, where they stored grain, how they fired pottery, what animals they kept, what imports they acquired, where they buried some of their dead. But the inward meanings tied to those acts survive unevenly. Material culture is eloquent, yet not complete. This is especially true when dealing with origins. The deeper the layer, the less likely it is to carry writing, and the more interpretation must rely on comparison, pattern, and context. Before texts become common, the earth speaks through objects and architecture. It tells you that people settled here, worshipped here, cooked here, irrigated here, buried here. It may suggest hierarchy, exchange, or changing diet, but it does not explain in words what those people believed about their own making. For that, you need later myths, later texts, later memory, and once later, memory enters. The evidence becomes a conversation between what the ground says and what inherited stories say. They illuminate each other, but they do not merge cleanly. Some have wondered whether archaeology is simply not dug deeply enough, either literally or conceptually, to uncover the earliest hidden phase remembered in myth. This is the point where fringe imagination often becomes most insistent. Buried pre-flood cities, erased strata, structures beneath sacred mounds, forgotten human phases masked by later rebuilding. Mainstream archaeology does not support dramatic versions of such claims, and many are far too confident for the evidence. Yet the temptation itself comes from something legitimate. Mesopotamian sites are profoundly layered, often difficult to excavate fully, and historically vulnerable to erosion, looting, water damage, political disruption, and incomplete early field methods. The Earth has lost much, and sometimes refuses the neat answers people want. A curious detail from archaeological history deepens the mood. Some of the earliest excavations in Mesopotamia were shaped by 19th and early 20th century methods that, while groundbreaking for their time, did not always preserve context to modern standards. Records could be incomplete. Stratigraphy might be simplified. Small finds and organic traces were not always treated with the care later archaeology would demand. Modern scholarship has corrected much, but not everything can be restored, in a strange way. Even the modern search for origins has its own missing tablets. Scholars remain divided on many foundational questions, not because the field is weak, but because the evidence is genuinely difficult. How fast did southern urbanism intensify? What balance of temple, household, and emerging state power best explains early institutions? How should symbolic artifacts be read in relation to lived religion? Which flood deposits matter locally, and which are being overconnected through later myth? Where do continuity and discontinuity between Ubaid to Uruk, Jemdet Nasr, and early dynastic faces feel strongest? None of these debates destroys the reality of Mesopotamian civilization. They reveal its depth. The earth, in other words, has not given up a confession. You kneel and touch a lump of excavated clay set aside from a trench. It is dry now, lighter than expected. Its hardness an effect of time and circumstance. Once it was floor or wall or vessel or ceiling. Once someone touched it with purpose. Now it lies anonymous, separated from the larger whole that gave it meaning. That transformation is almost a parable of human history. Things survive, but detached. Meanings survive, but displaced. The forbidden origin of humanity may persist in exactly this way. Not hidden behind one dramatic discovery, but spread across thousands of incomplete survivals that never quite lock together. And yet, archaeology has done something remarkable even within those limits. It has confirmed that the world of Mesopotamian myth was not invented in an empty imagination. There really were ancient temple centres with deep sequences of rebuilding. There really were cities whose bureaucratic life could inspire tales of cosmic assignment. There really were flood-prone landscapes, stratified institutions, sacred precincts, specialised labour, and astonishingly early experiments in writing and administration. The material world supports the plausibility of the mythic atmosphere, even when it cannot verify the mythic claims as literal events. Perhaps that is the right balance to keep. The ground confirms enough to take the old stories seriously as products of real civilizations facing real pressures. It withholds enough to prevent easy certainty. Some have wondered whether the refusal itself is meaningful, whether ancient origins must remain partly unexcavated because the first human story was always split between matter and meaning, between what can be unearthed and what can only be inherited through symbol. By noon, the trench is bright and unforgiving. The workers pause for water, dust clings to skin, notes are written, bags are labelled. The earth lies open for a moment, then begins already to seem secretive again, as though exposed layers are not revelations so much as brief permissions. Soon they will be drawn, photographed, backfilled, interpreted, debated, and still the oldest question remains, not absent, not disproved, simply unresolved in the most Mesopotamian way possible. The ground gives foundations, fragments, surfaces, installations, burials, drains, courtyards, and tablets. It does not give the whole beginning. What the earth still refuses is not evidence, but total explanation. It leaves you with enough to feel the reality of the ancient world, and enough silence to suspect that humanity's first remembered shape was always meant to be glimpsed only through dust, broken walls, and things half recovered from the soil. By afternoon, the light becomes gentler and certainty gives way to contemplation. The city is active, but the hard edge of morning has softened. Heat still rests on the walls, yet shadows have lengthened enough to create small islands of relief beside doorways and under awnings. A woman pauses with a jar against her hip. A boy drifts a reed in slow circles through canal water while waiting for an older voice to call him back to some task. A temple singer carries himself with deliberate calm through a side court. Even work seems less forceful at this hour, as if the day itself is briefly willing to think. It is in this softened light that the old question begins to turn inward, not toward proof, but toward meaning. Perhaps the myth remembers more than facts. It may be that the Mesopotamian stories of clay, divine mixture, labour, flood, kingship, guarded wisdom, and sacred assignment are not fragments of literal history in the narrow modern sense. Yet they may still preserve something deeply true about how ancient people understood what it felt like to be human, to be made from ordinary material and yet burdened with awareness, to live inside systems older than oneself, to inherit work, ritual, hierarchy, and memory without ever seeing their full beginning, to feel that life was shaped on purpose, but not for reasons completely disclosed. This is not a lesser truth. In some ways, it may be the more enduring one. A grounded historical detail supports that thought. Comparative mythology often shows that societies use origin narratives not only to explain the past, but to organize the present. Creation stories justify institutions, normalize labor, establish sacred geography, and shape ideas of proper relationship between humans and the divine. Mesopotamian myths certainly do these things, but to say they are socially useful does not mean they are empty of deeper memory. A myth can be practical and profound at the same time. It can instruct a city while preserving emotional knowledge far older than the city's current form. You begin to notice how many of the great motifs return to one central human feeling: insufficiency paired with importance. Humanity is not all-powerful, but neither is it trivial. Humans are made to serve, yet they carry culture. They are bounded, yet they ask cosmological questions. They live after flood and forgetting, yet continue to preserve names and signs. They are not the first beings in the sacred order, yet the gods still require something from them. This is a subtle portrait of the human condition, one that feels remarkably mature. It does not flatter, it does not despair. It places humanity somewhere in between. Some have wondered whether this in-between quality is why the Sumerian material continues to fascinate people who sense that modern accounts of human origin, though scientifically powerful, do not satisfy every kind of question. Biology can explain development, archaeology can trace settlement and technology, comparative philology can reconstruct words and motifs. But none of these alone answers what ancient people most urgently felt while standing under a hot sky, beside a canal or a temple wall, why consciousness feels like both a gift and a burden. The Mesopotamian myths may not solve that question either, but they honour it. Scholars remain divided on how much of primeval myth should be read as inherited memory, how much as literary construction, and how much as ideological reflection of later institutions. Those divisions are healthy. They keep the field honest. Yet perhaps the deeper issue is not choosing one explanation over all others, but recognising that myths often gather several kinds of truth at once. A flood can be both a remembered environmental threat and a symbol of civilizational rupture. A creation from clay can reflect the material world of mud brick culture, and also the feeling of bodily fragility. Divine decree can mirror temple hierarchy, and also express the intuition that life arrives already structured. One unusual detail keeps returning to the mind. Across the old Mesopotamian traditions, human beings are almost never imagined as self-originating. They are always in relation to gods, to ancestors, to kingship, to land, to water, to labour, to sacred powers already present in the world. This is different from many modern habits of thought. which place so much emphasis on the isolated individual. In the ancient view, the human being is not an independent beginning. It is a participant in a layered order. Perhaps that is why the myth feels older than any one tablet. A tablet can break, a city can fall. A god's name can change from Sumerian to Akkadian and still keep part of its character. But the underlying emotional pattern survives. You're born into a world you did not design. You inherit duties before fully understanding them. You sense that knowledge exists beyond your access. You work to maintain structures that will outlast you. You're made of perishable matter, yet carry symbols, songs, and memories that strain toward permanence. This is not only Mesopotamian, it is human. But the Mesopotamians gave it one of its earliest surviving and most haunting forms. You sit in our imagination beside the canal where afternoon light has turned the water a muted copper colour. Reeds sway. Mud smells warm and faintly sweet. Somewhere a temple drum sounds once and then stops. The whole scene seems balanced between visibility and disappearance. That balance may be the real subject of the old origin stories. Not hidden aliens, not secret laboratories beneath the desert, not literal codes waiting for modern decoding. Something quieter, a recognition that humanity may have been understood from the beginning as a threshold creature, standing between earth and transcendence, service and insight, memory and loss. Of course, some have wondered whether there truly was more, a deeper layer of forgotten history, an older world from which only symbols remain. The evidence cannot confirm such hopes in the dramatic forms often imagined, yet the question itself may be telling. People continue to ask it because the myths leave a residue. They do not close the door. They leave enough space for the possibility that the earliest human self-understanding was richer, stranger, and more reverent toward mystery than later simplified accounts allow. The city continues around you, practical and untroubled by these reflections. Bread is still being baked, accounts are still being tallied, repairs are still being made to a wall cracked by sun. No one needs to settle the origin of humanity in order to finish the day's work, and yet the myths remain in the background, like the scent of clay after water touches it, faint but unmistakable. They continue to whisper that what humans are cannot be reduced entirely to function. Even in a civilization that cared so much about function, by the time the sun lowers toward evening, the thought has become very calm. It may be that the forbidden origin of humanity hidden in Sumerian myth was never forbidden, because it was dangerous knowledge in the modern sense. It may have been forbidden because it would not stay simple. It refused to let humans see themselves only as masters, only as servants, only as bodies, or only as souls. It remembered too much complexity. And complexity, especially when ancient and sacred, often survives not as certainty, but as an unfinished feeling that follows you long after the words are done. Evening returns the world to stillness one last time. The heat begins to leave the walls. Colours fade from the baked brick until the city seems made less of matter than of memory. Smoke rises from cooking fires in thin blue lines that disappear into the darkening sky. Reeds along the canal turn black at the edges. Water reflects the first stars before the streets have fully quieted. It is the hour when outlines soften and categories lose some of their confidence. Temple and house, labour and prayer, past and present, all seem to drift closer together. And in that softened hour, the story of humanity hidden in Sumerian myth becomes less like an argument and more like a final image held in the mind. You have walked through fragments, ruins, floodwater, guarded texts, divine roles, temple economies, king lists, missing lines, hidden springs, maternal shaping, and the endless pressure of labour under heaven. None of it has given you a final answer. The ancient world rarely does. What it gives instead is atmosphere joined to structure, the feeling that human life was never thought to be accidental, the impression that people were shaped into an order already underway, the suggestion that what was given to humanity was both enough and not enough to build, remember, worship, count, and endure. Not enough to see the whole design. Perhaps that is why these old myths still breathe. A grounded historical fact remains at the centre of them. Mesopotamian civilization really did emerge through extraordinary collective skill in agriculture, urban planning, administration, ritual practice, and writing. The people who told these stories were not dreamers detached from reality. They lived in one of the earliest great urban civilizations on Earth. They managed canals, tracked goods, trained scribes, rebuilt temples, and left behind one of humanity's first large textual archives. Their myths grew from that reality and cannot be separated from it. And yet, alongside that realism, there remains the unusual and difficult residue that refuses to vanish. Humans made from clay and divine matter, labour inherited from prior beings, kingship descending from heaven, floods dividing one kind of world from another, sacred powers distributed from above, old wisdom guarded and only partly transmitted. None of this proves a lost secret in the literal sense. Scholars remain divided on many details, and responsible reading requires restraint. But the pattern itself is enough to create a strange calm. The Sumerians and their successors did not imagine humanity as simple. They imagined it as burdened, bounded, and mysteriously placed. Some have wondered whether the deepest hidden origin is this very placement. Not that humans once knew a technological secret and forgot it. Not that one missing tablet will someday explain everything. But that from the very beginning, people sensed themselves as beings who belonged to Earth while carrying an element that did not feel entirely earthly. Bodies of mud and breath. Yes, but also of duty, symbol, and inwardness. Creatures capable of laying bricks all day and still lifting their eyes at night to ask why they were here. That tension may be the oldest inheritance of all. You sit in imagination on the edge of the canal as darkness gathers more completely. The city behind you grows quieter with each passing moment. Somewhere, a final door closes. Somewhere, a lamp is covered. Somewhere, the last voice in a courtyard settles into silence. The stars above Mesopotamia are very old stars, and under them the first river cities once tried to understand what kind of life had awakened inside them. Their answer was never neat. It was clay and decree, birth and burden, flood and survival, wisdom and limit. It was a human origin story that carried reverence and discomfort in equal measure. Maybe that is why it still feels unfinished now, because the ending was never meant to arrive as a conclusion. The old stories do not close around humanity like a sealed box. They leave openings. They leave missing lines. They leave long pauses between preserved words. They leave you looking at a tablet with a broken edge and realizing that the silence may be part of the inheritance. A complete explanation would have been easier to preserve. What survived instead was a mystery disciplined by ritual and softened by time. Night deepens. The reeds murmur. The canal darkens until it seems to hold not water but shadow. The city becomes a low black shape under the stars, a place built from clay by beings who themselves believed they had been made from clay. And that final image is perhaps the gentlest truth of all. Human beings in the Mesopotamian imagination were never fully at home in the world, yet never separate from it either. They belonged to the earth completely, and at the same time carried a question the earth could not answer. So the forbidden origin of humanity hidden in Sumerian myth remains where it has perhaps always belonged, not inside a solved doctrine, but in the quiet space between survival and wonder, between the brick in the hand and the star above the temple roof, between what the tablets say and what their broken edges still refuse to tell. The night is cooler now, and the city has nearly dissolved into silence. You let the old images settle one by one. Wet clay pressed by careful hands, reed boats drifting through dark canals, temple lamps flickering behind thick walls, a scribe leaning over a tablet whose story was already ancient when he copied it, a birth goddess shaping fragile life from earth, a hidden spring beneath the ground, a king receiving rule from above, floodwater rising over all that was once familiar. Then, after the waters withdraw, people returning again to brick, barley, song, and memory. You do not need to force any of it into certainty. Perhaps the oldest myths endure because they leave room for sleep, room for wandering, room for things that cannot be held all at once. The people of Mesopotamia lived close to mud, water, labour, and sky. From those materials they built not only cities, but a way of thinking about what it means to be human, temporary, yet meaningful, limited, yet aware, bound to the ground, yet always looking beyond it. And now the canal is almost black, the stars are bright, and the last warmth has gone from the bricks. The old world rests where it has rested for thousands of years, half buried in earth, half alive in story. You let it remain there, unfinished and gentle, as the night closes over river, reed, temple, and clay. End of script. Good night.